Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. In the land of Ingery, where 7-league boots and cloaks of invisibility really exist, it is a misfortune to be born eldest of 3. You will fail first and worst if you set out to seek your fortune. Sophie Hatter was the eldest of 3 sisters. She was not even the child of a poor woodcutter. Her parents kept a hat shop in prosperous Market Chipping. True, her mother died when Sophie was 2, and her sister Letty was 1, and their father married a girl called Fanny. Fanny gave birth to Martha. This ought to have made Sophie and Letty into ugly sisters, but all 3 girls grew up very pretty. Early one spring, everyone began talking of the Witch of the Waste. It was said the witch had threatened the king's daughter, and he had commanded Wizard Suleiman to deal with her. It seemed that Wizard Suleiman had not only failed to deal with the witch, he had got himself killed. So when a tall black castle suddenly appeared on the hills above Market Chipping, everybody thought that the witch had moved out of the waste. What made it scarier was that the castle moved about. Everyone was certain that it would come down into the valley before long, but the castle stayed roving the hills, and it was learned that it did not belong to the witch, but to Wizard Howl. Wizard Howl was bad enough. He was known to collect girls' souls, or some said he ate their hearts. No young girl was safe from him. Sophie, Letty, and Martha were warned never to go out alone. Then Mr. Hatter died suddenly. When the funeral was over, Fanny explained the situation. "I've been doing sums," she said, "and the only way I can take care of you is to see you all settled in promising apprenticeships. Letty, I've arranged for you to be apprenticed to Cesare's, the pastry cook in Market Square." Letty laughed, but she was not pleased. "Thank you," she said. "Isn't it lucky that I like cooking?" Fanny looked relieved. "Now, Martha, you know my old friend Annabel Fairfax? Isn't she a witch?" said Martha. "Yes, with a lovely house and clients all over the Folding Valley," Fanny said. "She'll teach you all she knows." She's a nice lady," Martha conceded. "All right." Finally, Fanny said, "Now, Sophie, it seems only right that you should inherit the hat shop, so I've decided to take you as apprentice." Fanny set Sophie to trimming hats. Sophie sat in a small alcove, sewing roses to bonnets and lining them with silk. She quite liked it, but she felt isolated and dull. The most interesting thing was the talk from the customers. Sophie heard that the mayor never would eat vegetables, and that Wizard Howl's castle had moved to the cliffs again. Really, that man. And wasn't Jane Farrier a perfect disgrace? That one would never attract even Wizard Howl, let alone a respectable man. Then there would be a whisper about the Witch of the Waste. But by the end of the month, the gossip was suddenly about Letty. Cesare's was packed with gentlemen, morning to night, demanding to be served by Letty. She'd had 10 proposals of marriage and refused them all. "I call that sensible," Sophie said to a bonnet. Sophie talked to hats more and more as weeks went by. "You have mysterious allure," she told one with veiling. To a creamy hat with roses, she said, "You are going to have to marry money." And to a caterpillar green straw, she said, "You are young as a spring leaf." She told a mushroom-pleated bonnet, "You have a heart of gold, and someone in a high position will fall in love with you." Jane Farrier bought it next day. But everyone seemed to be buying hats and bonnets around then. It was almost May Day. Then someone asked for one with mushroom pleats, like the one Jane Farrier had been wearing when she ran off with the Count of Cataract. Apparently, the king had quarrelled with his brother, Prince Justin, who had gone into exile. The Count of Cataract had been sent to look for him, and met Jane Farrier instead. Sophie listened and felt sad. She decided to go round to Cesare's to talk to Letty when the hat shop was closed for May Day. When May Day came, Sophie put a grey shawl over her grey dress and went out into the street. There was far too much noise and jostling, and Sophie felt overwhelmed. It was as if the past months of sitting and sewing had turned her into an old woman. She crept along, trying to avoid being trodden on. When she reached Market Square, it was worse. Crowds of young men swaggered beerily to and fro, calling loudly and accosting girls. When a young man in a fantastical blue and silver costume spotted Sophie, she tried to hide. "It's all right, little grey mouse," the man laughed. "I only want to buy you a drink." His pitying look made Sophie ashamed. He was so dashing, with elaborate blonde hair. His sleeves were all scalloped edges and silver insets. "No, thank you, sir," Sophie stammered. I'm on my way to see my sister." "Who am I to keep a pretty lady from her sister?" he laughed. "Shall I go with you, since you seem so scared?" "No, thank you," Sophie gasped, and fled. Cesare's was as packed and as noisy as the square. Sophie had to fight her way through to the counter. Letty saw her and looked shaken for a moment. Then her smile widened, and she yelled, "Sophie! Can I talk to you somewhere?" Sophie shouted. Letty seized Sophie's wrist and dragged her into the back of the shop. "Sit down," she said, handing Sophie a cake. "You may need this." Sophie sank onto a stool. "Oh, Letty, I'm so glad to see you." "And I'm glad you're sitting down," said Letty. "You see, I'm not Letty. I'm Martha." "What?" Sophie stared. She looked like Letty. "I'm Martha," said her sister. "Promise you won't tell." "I promise," Sophie said. Oh, she could see it was Martha now. There was Martha's tilt to Letty's head and Martha's way of twiddling her thumbs. But why? How? Letty wanted to learn witchcraft, and I didn't. "Only try telling that to Mother," Martha said. "It only took me 2 weeks to find the spell we're using. Then I came here, and Letty went back to Mrs. Fairfax, pretending to be me." Sophie chomped at cake she was not tasting. "What made you do it?" Martha grinned. "I want to get married and have 10 children." "I never knew," exclaimed Sophie. "Well, it wasn't much good going on about it when you were so busy backing Mother up about me making my fortune," Martha said. "Letty and I are fine, but we feel bad about you. You're far too clever and nice to be stuck in that shop." "I'm all right," Sophie said. "All right?" Martha exclaimed. "You don't visit for months, then turn up in a frightful grey dress, looking as if even I scare you. What's Mother been doing to you?" "Nothing," Sophie said uncomfortably. "You shouldn't talk about Fanny that way." "Mother knows how beautiful you are," Martha retorted. "She's got you slaving away, and I bet she doesn't pay you." "I'm an apprentice," Sophie protested. "So am I, but I get a wage," said Martha. "You're a genius with hats, and Mother knows it. You earn the money, while she goes off gadding. Listen." But at that moment, an apprentice stuck his head through from the back somewhere. "The new baking's up. Tell them," he grinned. Martha sprang up and seized a cake rack. Sophie helped her hump it into the noisy shop. "You must do something about yourself, Sophie," Martha panted as they went. Sophie yelled goodbye and slipped away in the bustle. She needed to think. She thought most of the following week, and all that happened was that she became confused and discontented. Sophie was mostly alone in the shop. Fanny did seem to be out a lot, gadding, or not. "Maybe I am being exploited," she told a hat she was finishing with waxed cherries. "But someone has to do this, or there will be no hats to sell." "Does it matter if there are no hats to sell?" She looked round the assembled hats, and she almost set out to seek her fortune until she remembered she was the eldest, and there was no point. The shop bell clanged, and a grand customer sailed in. A young man followed the lady, a slightly formless-faced person with reddish hair, pale and obviously upset. He stared at Sophie with a kind of beseeching horror. "Miss Hatter?" the lady asked. "Yes," said Sophie. The man looked more upset than ever. "I hear you sell the most heavenly hats," said the lady. "Show me." Sophie got out hats. The lady began rejecting them. "Dimples," she said to the pink bonnet, and "youth" to the caterpillar green one. "Mysterious allure, how very obvious." You're wasting my time, Miss Hatter. This is a small shop, madam, Sophie said. Why did you bother to come in? Behind the lady, the man seemed to be trying to signal warningly. I always bother when someone tries to set themselves up against the Witch of the Waste, said the lady. I don't care for your competition or your attitude, Miss Hatter. I came to put a stop to you. There. She spread out her hand towards Sophie's face. You mean you're the Witch of the Waste? Sophie quavered. I am, said the lady. Let that teach you to meddle with things that belong to me. There must be some mistake, Sophie croaked. The man was now staring at her in horror. No mistake, Miss Hatter, said the witch. Come, Gaston. She swept to the door. By the way, you won't be able to tell anyone you're under a spell, she added. Sophie put her hands to her face. She felt soft, leathery wrinkles. She looked at her hands. They were wrinkled too. Sophie found she had to hobble to the mirror. The face staring out at her was that of a gaunt old woman with wispy white hair. Don't worry, old thing, Sophie said to the face. You look healthy. Besides, this is much more like you really are. Everything seemed to have gone calm and remote. She was not even particularly angry with the witch. Well, I shall have to do for her when I get the chance, she told herself. But I can't stay here. Fanny would have a fit. Sophie hobbled to the shop door and put up the closed notice. She wrapped her shawl over her head and shoulders. Then she collected her purse and a parcel of bread and cheese and hobbled away down the street. It was a warm day, and Sophie's back soon began to ache. She hobbled sturdily enough, but she needed a stick. She thought she saw one, but it proved to be the end of an old scarecrow. It had a withered turnip for a face. Sophie found she had some fellow feeling for it, and stuck it upright in a hedge. There, she cackled. Neither of us are up to much, are we, my friend? If I wasn't doomed to failure, you could come to life and help me make my fortune. But I wish you luck, anyway. An hour later, she sat down on a bank to eat her bread and cheese. There were noises behind her. Little, strangled squeakings. Sophie peered into the hedge and discovered a thin, grey dog, hopelessly trapped by a stout stick, which had somehow got twisted into a rope tied round its neck. The dog could barely move. Sophie felt in her pocket for her scissors, then reached into the hedge and sawed at the rope. It took a lot of sawings before the dog was able to drag itself out. Then it growled and slunk away. There's gratitude for you, said Sophie. But you left me a gift in spite of yourself. She pulled the stick that had trapped the dog out of the hedge and found it was a proper walking stick, tipped with iron. Sophie finished her food and set off walking again. The lane became steeper, and she found the stick a great help. It was also something to talk to. There's 2 encounters, she said, and not a scrap of magical gratitude from either. Still, you're a good stick. I'm not grumbling. Shortly, the hedges gave way to bare banks, and the land beyond became heathery upland. I never realized before what old people had to put up with, she panted as she labored uphill. As night approached, Sophie's panting and the creaking of her limbs were so loud in her ears that it took her a while to notice that some of the grinding and puffing was not coming from her at all. She looked up blurrily. Wizard Howl's castle was rumbling and bumping towards her. It looked tall and ugly and very sinister indeed. Sophie leaned on her stick. She was not particularly frightened. She wondered how it moved. But the main thing in her mind was that all that smoke puffing out must mean a large fire somewhere inside. Well, why not? She said to her stick. Wizard Howl is not likely to want my soul. He takes only young girls. She waved her stick imperiously at the castle. Stop! She shrieked. The castle came to a rumbling halt. It was built of huge black blocks like coal. Sophie thought of chairs and firesides and stretched out eagerly to the castle door. Some invisible wall stopped her hand about a foot away. Sophie prodded at it with her stick. "Open up!" That made no difference. "Very well," Sophie said. "I'll find your back door." She hobbled off to the left, but she could not get round the corner of the castle. At this, Sophie said a word that neither old ladies nor young girls are supposed to know, and stumped uphill to the right-hand corner. There was no barrier there. She hobbled towards the big black door in that side of the castle. There was another barrier. Black smoke blew down from the battlements in clouds. Sophie coughed. "I'll speak to Howl about this," she said, and set off fiercely round the next corner. There was a third door. The castle started to move again as Sophie got near. "Oh, no, you don't," Sophie shouted. She hit the door violently with her stick. "Open up!" The door sprang open inwards. Sophie managed to get one foot on the step. Then she hopped and scrambled as the castle gathered speed. "What a stupid way to treat a building," she panted as she threw herself inside. When she began to get her breath, she realized there was a boy standing in front of her. "Don't you have the impudence to shut the door on me, my boy?" she said. "I wasn't going to," he protested. "What do you want?" Sophie looked round. There were things hanging from the beams, bunches of herbs and strange roots. There was also a grinning human skull. There was a fireplace with a small fire burning, and beside it was a low chair with a cushion. Sophie dived for that chair. If anyone wanted to turn her out, they were going to have to use extreme and violent magic to do it. "Tell Wizard Howl," she said to the boy, "that this castle's going to come apart around his ears." "The castle's bespelled to hold together," the boy said. "But I'm afraid Howl's not here." This was good news. "When will he be back?" Sophie asked. "Probably tomorrow," the boy said. "Can I help? I'm Howl's apprentice, Michael." This was better news. "Only the wizard can help me," Sophie said firmly. "I'll wait. Tell him the name's Sophie. Old Sophie." To make it plain that she had no intention of being turned out, Sophie closed her eyes and pretended to go to sleep. She intended to be well away from here by the time Howl came back and raised objections. The kitchen, or workshop, was cozy and very peaceful. Sophie went properly to sleep and snored. She did not wake when there came a flash and a muted bang from the workbench. She did not stir when Michael put a log on the fire, or when he remarked to the fireplace, "She's got all her teeth. She's not the Witch of the Waste, is she?" "I wouldn't have let her come in if she was," the fireplace retorted. In the middle of the night, Sophie woke up. She shivered, then heaved a log on the fire, which sent a spray of sparks up the chimney. She sat back, with a nervous look behind, where the firelight was dancing over the polished brown bone of the skull. "He's got both feet in the grave, and I've only got one," she consoled herself. She settled more comfortably and stared dreamily into the flames, and began imagining a face. "A thin blue face," she murmured, "with a thin blue nose. Suppose I didn't go until Howl gets back. Wizards can lift spells, and those purple flames make the mouth. 2 green tufts for eyebrows." Curiously enough, the only orange flames in the fire were under the green eyebrow flames, just like eyes. On the other hand, if the spell was off, I'd have my heart eaten before I could turn round. "Don't you want your heart eaten?" asked the fire. It was definitely the fire that spoke. Sophie saw its purple mouth move. "Naturally I don't," Sophie answered. "What are you?" "A fire demon. I'm bound to this hearth by contract." "And what are you?" "I can see you're under a spell." This roused Sophie. "Can you take it off?" she exclaimed. The orange eyes studied her. "It's strong. It feels like one of the Witch of the Wastes." "It is," said Sophie, "but I detect 2 layers." "And you can't tell anyone about it. unless they know already. I shall have to study it. How long will that take? Sophie asked. A while, said the demon. How about making a bargain? I'll break your spell if you break my contract. Sophie looked warily at the demon's thin blue face. Are you being honest? Not completely, admitted the demon. But do you want to stay like that? The spell has shortened your life by about 60 years. That was a nasty thought. This contract, Sophie said. It's with Wizard Howl, is it? Of course, said the demon. I'm fastened to this hearth, and I can't stir. I'm forced to do most of the magic around here. I have to keep the castle moving and do all the special effects that scare people. Howl's quite heartless, you know. Sophie thought of herself making hats, while Fanny went gadding. All right, she said. An eager purple grin spread across the demon's face. You agree to a bargain? If you agree to break the spell on me, Sophie said, with a sense of saying something fatal. Done, cried the demon. I'll break your spell when you break my contract. Tell me how, Sophie said. The orange eyes glinted. I can't. Part of the contract is that neither the wizard nor I can say what the main clause is. You can find out if you watch and listen carefully. I implore you to try. The contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run. But that means I'll have to stay here in Howl's castle, Sophie objected. What possible excuse can I give for doing that? We'll think of one. Howl's too wrapped up in himself to see beyond his nose half the time. We can deceive him. Very well, Sophie said. I'll stay. Now find an excuse. When Sophie woke up, daylight was streaming across her. She hobbled over to the window. To her astonishment, the view from it was of a dockside town. Wherever am I? Sophie asked, scowled. I don't expect you to answer that, my friend, she added hastily and turned round to take a look at the room. It was quite small, and by daylight it was amazingly dirty. The stone floor was stained and greasy, and cobwebs hung in dusty droops from the beams. Sophie peered into the sink and shuddered at the pink and grey slime there. The rest of the castle had to be beyond one of the 4 black doors around the room. Sophie opened the nearest and found a large bathroom. It was even dirtier than the other room. Sophie winced from the toilet and recoiled from green weed growing in the shower. The mirrors were plastered with blobs of nameless substances. The nameless substances themselves were crowded onto a shelf over the bath. The biggest jar was called drying power. Sophie was not sure whether there should be a D in that or not. She picked up a packet. It had skin scrawled on it. Another jar said eyes. A tube stated for decay. It seems to work, too, said Sophie, grimacing at the wash basin. The next door opened onto a flight of wooden stairs. Sophie hobbled to the next door, which opened onto a poky backyard with high brick walls. She opened the 4th door, and it was a broom cupboard with 2 velvet cloaks hanging there. The only other door was the one Sophie had come in by last night. She cautiously opened that and watched Heather slide past, listening to the rumble and grind of the black stones as the castle moved. Then she shut the door and went to the window. And there was the seaport town. I don't understand, Sophie told the human skull. She went and put a couple of logs on the fire. A long blue face with flaming green hair shot upwards. Good morning, said the fire demon. Don't forget we have a bargain. So none of it was a dream. Sophie sat for a while, staring, and did not pay attention to the sounds of Michael getting up, until she found him standing beside her. Would you like some breakfast? He asked. Sophie found she was ravenous. Yes, she said. I'm afraid there's only bread and cheese, Michael said. But there's a whole basket of eggs, Sophie said. And isn't that bacon? Howl's the only one who can cook, Michael said. I can cook, said Sophie. She reached for a large black pan. You don't understand, Michael said. It's Calcifer, the fire demon. He won't bend down his head to be cooked on for anyone but Howl. The fire demon flickered wickedly. I refuse to be exploited, he said. You mean, Sophie said to Michael, that you have to do without even a hot drink unless Howl's here? Michael gave an embarrassed nod. Then you're the one that's being exploited, said Sophie. She plunked bacon into the pan and marched to the fireplace. Now, Calcifer, she said, bend down your head. You can't make me, crackled the fire demon. Oh, yes, I can. Sophie got herself creakingly onto her knees by the hearth and whispered, I can go back on our bargain or tell Howl about it, can't I? Oh, curses! Calcifer spat. Why did you let her in, Michael? Sulkily, he bent his blue face forward until all that could be seen was a ring of curly green flames. Thank you, Sophie said, and slapped down the heavy pan. I hope your bacon burns, Calcifer said, muffled under the pan. The door opened, but Sophie did not notice because of the sizzling bacon. Oh, hello, Howl, Michael said, helplessly. Sophie hurriedly turned round and stared. A tall, young fellow, in a flamboyant blue and silver suit, had just come in. He brushed fair hair from his glass-green eyes and stared back. Who on earth are you? Said Howl. Where have I seen you before? I am a total stranger, Sophie lied firmly. After all, Howl had only met her long enough to call her a mouse before, so it was almost true. And she would have died rather than let this overdressed boy know she was the girl he had pitied on May Day. She says her name's Sophie, Michael said. How did she make Calcifer bend down? Said Howl. She bullied me, Calcifer said in a piteous, muffled voice. Not many people can do that, Howl said thoughtfully. He shoved Sophie aside. Calcifer doesn't like anyone but me to cook on him. Tell me why you've come. Sophie stared at the blue jewel hanging from Howl's ear. Why I came, because I'm your new cleaning lady, of course. I can clean the dirt from this place, even if I can't clean you from your wickedness, young man. Howl's not wicked, Michael said. Yes, I am, Howl contradicted. You can take me on a month's trial, if you like, Sophie said. Wizard Howl said nothing but, Plates, please, Michael. Sophie made another attempt. If I'm going to be cleaning here, I'd like to know where the rest of the castle is. I can only find this room and the bathroom. To her surprise, both Michael and the wizard roared with laughter. There isn't any more of the castle, Michael said, except 2 bedrooms upstairs. What? Sophie exclaimed. Howl and Calcifer invented the castle, Michael explained, and Calcifer keeps it going. The inside is really just Howl's house in Port Haven. That's too bad, Sophie said. What do you mean by having this great ugly castle rushing about the hills and frightening everyone to death? Howl shrugged. What an outspoken old woman you are. I need to demonstrate my power and wickedness. Sophie shortly discovered that the castle had other peculiarities. Michael was piling the plates in the slimy sink when there came a loud knocking at the door. Calcifer blazed up. Kingsbury door! Howl went to the door. There was a square wooden knob above it, set into the lintel, with a dab of paint on each of its 4 sides. There was a green blob at the bottom, but Howl turned the knob round so that it had a red blob downward before he opened the door. Outside stood a personage wearing a stiff white wig. He bowed. His Majesty the King presents his compliments and sends payments for 2,000 pair of 7-league boots, this person said. Behind him, Sophie had glimpses of a street full of sumptuous houses with towers and domes. Howl took the purse, bowed back, and shut the door. Then he turned the square knob so that the green blob was downward again and stowed the purse in his pocket. Howl went to the bathroom then, calling, I need hot water, Calcifer, and was gone for a long, long time. Sophie could not restrain her curiosity. Wherever was that? She asked. That door gives on Kingsbury, Michael said. where the king lives. I think that was the Chancellor's clerk, and I wish he hadn't given Howl all that money. Is Howl going to let me stay? Sophie asked. If he is, you'll never pin him down, Michael answered. Sophie decided to show Howl that she was an excellent cleaning lady. She rolled her sleeves up, grabbed a bucket and besom, and got to work. What are you doing? Cried Michael and Calcifer in a horrified chorus. Cleaning, Sophie replied firmly. The place is a disgrace. Calcifer said, It doesn't need it. And Michael muttered, Howl will kick you out. But Sophie ignored them. Dust flew in clouds. In the midst of it, there came another set of thumps at the door. Calcifer blazed up, calling, Port Haven door, and sneezed. Sophie saw Michael turn the square knob so that the side with a blue blob of paint on it was downward. Then he opened the door on the street you saw out of the window. A small girl stood there. Please, Mr. Fisher, she said. I've come for that spell. Safety spell for your dad's boat, wasn't it? Michael said. He measured powder from a jar into a square of paper. The girl took it and passed over a coin. Has the sorcerer got a witch working for him? She asked, peering at Sophie. Yes, my child, Sophie called. I'm the best and cleanest witch in Ingery. Michael shut the door, exasperated. That will be all round Port Haven now. Howl may not like that. He turned the knob green down. Sophie cackled, quite unrepentant. She sprinkled water to lay the dust, then she swept the floor again. She swept away towards the door in order to have a look at the square knob above it. The fourth side had a blob of black paint on it. Wondering where that led, Sophie began briskly sweeping cobwebs off the beams. Howl came out of the bathroom just then in a wave of steamy perfume. He took one look and backed away. Stop it, woman! Leave those poor spiders alone! Those cobwebs are a disgrace, Sophie declared. Then get them down and leave the spiders, said Howl. And keep that broom still while I fetch my guitar. Sophie leaned on the broom and watched Howl. If the red blob leads to Kingsbury and the blue blob goes to Port Haven, where does the black blob take you? She asked. What a nosy old woman you are, said Howl. That leads to my private boat hole, and you are not being told where it is. He opened the door. You are not to kill a single spider while I'm away. And the door slammed behind him. Sophie concluded Howl was off to hunt young girls and got down to work with more righteous vigor than ever. By the time he returned, Sophie had swept and scrubbed herself into a state when she could hardly move. Michael towed Howl over to the bathroom. Sophie heard phrases like, terrible old biddy, and won't listen to a word, even though Calcifer was roaring, Howl, stop her! She's killing us! All Howl said was, did you kill any spiders? Of course not, Sophie snapped. What are they? All the girls whose hearts you ate? No, just spiders. Howl laughed and went upstairs. Michael sighed. He went into the broom cupboard and found an old folding bed and some rugs, which he put into the space under the stairs. You'd better sleep here tonight, he told Sophie. Does that mean Howl's going to let me stay? Sophie asked. I don't know, Michael said irritably. Howl never commits himself. I was here 6 months before he made me his apprentice. I just thought a bed would be better than a chair. In the days that followed, Sophie cleaned her way remorselessly through the castle, looking for clues. The human skull, she fancied, began to look as long-suffering as Michael. It had been moved so often. Sophie cleaned the bathroom nick. Now we'll see about that contract, she muttered at the bar. But her main target was the packets and jars. She took every one of them down on the pretext of scrubbing the shelf and carefully examined them to see if the ones labeled skin, eyes, and hair were pieces of girl. As far as she could tell, they were all just creams and powders. That night, Calcifer grumbled that he had drained one hot spring dry for her. When are you going to stop cleaning and find out how to break my contract? He said. In good time, said Sophie. How can I get the terms out of Howl if he's never in? Is he always away this much? Only when he's after a lady, Calcifer said. The next day, Sophie tried to start from the backyard, but it was raining when Sophie opened the door. Instead, she found a bucket of whitewash and a large paintbrush and set to work on the walls and ceiling. It rained for the next 2 days in Port Haven. Sophie whitewashed her cubbyhole, the stairs, the landing, and Michael's room. "What's happened in here?" Howl asked on the third day. "It seems lighter." "Sophie," Michael said in a voice of doom. "I should have guessed," Howl said, disappearing into the bathroom. "He noticed," Michael whispered to Calcifer. "The girl must be giving in at last." Next day, as soon as Howl was out of the door, Sophie set off like an avenging angel to clean Howl's bedroom. She had not even dared peep into it before, and that was silly, she thought, as she hobbled upstairs. By now it was clear that Calcifer did all the strong magic, and Michael did all the hack work, while Howl gadded, exploiting the other two just as Fanny had exploited her. She arrived on the landing and found Howl standing in the doorway of his bedroom, completely blocking her way. "No, you don't," he said quite pleasantly. Sophie gaped. "Where did you come from? I saw you go out." "I meant you to," said Howl. "It stood to reason you'd descend on me today. And I am a wizard, you know. Didn't you think I could do magic?" "Everyone knows you're a wizard, young man," Sophie said severely. "But your castle is the dirtiest place I've ever been." She looked into the room, but Howl swung his blue and silver sleeve in front of her face. "Uh-oh. Don't be nosy." "I'm not being nosy," Sophie protested. "That room—" "Yes, you are," said Howl. "You're a nosy, bossy, appallingly clean old woman." "But it's a pigsty," said Sophie. "I can't help what I am." "Yes, you can," said Howl. "Now go downstairs and think of something else to do." Sophie was a little shaken and very surprised that Howl had not thrown her out of the castle. But since he had not, she sallied out into the yard and began vigorously sorting through piles of rubbish. There was a metallic clash, and Howl appeared again, stumbling slightly. "Not here either," he said. "I won't be able to find things if you tidy them up. Tidying up is what I'm here for," Sophie shouted. "Then you must think of a new meaning for your life," Howl said. "Now trot along indoors and find something else to do before I get angry. I hate getting angry." Sophie folded her skinny arm. "You don't like anything unpleasant, do you? You're a slitherer outer. That's what you are." Howl gave a forced sort of smile. "Well, now we both know each other's faults. Now go back into the house. Go on, back." He advanced on Sophie, and his sleeve caught an edge of rusty metal and tore. "Damnation! Look what you made me do!" "I can mend it," Sophie said. Howl gave her a glassy look. He took his torn sleeve between the fingers of his right hand and pulled it through them, and then there was no tear at all. "There, understand?" Sophie hobbled back indoors, rather chastened. Howl really was a wizard to be reckoned with. "Why didn't he turn me out?" she said. "I think he goes by Calcifer," said Mike. "Most people who come here either don't notice Calcifer, or they're scared stiff of him." Howl did not go out for the next few days. Sophie discovered a pile of Michael's clothes that needed mending. She set to work, and by evening she was fairly cheerful. "Happy in your work?" Howl said sarcastically. "I need more to do," Sophie said. "My old suit needs mending, if you have to feel busy," said Howl. This seemed to mean that Howl was no longer annoyed. Sophie was relieved. Howl had not yet caught the girl he was after. Sophie listened to Michael asking rather obvious questions about it, and Howl slithering neatly out of answering. "Can't face his own wickedness," Sophie murmured to a pair of socks. Another overdressed and scented messenger arrived with a letter and a request from the king. Howl was wonderfully long-winded in reply. He said no, but the messenger spoke for a further half-hour, at the end of which Howl agreed to do the spell. "This is ominous," Howl said to Michael. "Why did Solomon have to get himself lost? The king seems to think I'll do instead." "He wasn't as inventive as you, by all accounts," Michael said. "I'm too patient and polite," Howl said gloomily. "I should have overcharged him even more." Sophie sewed buttons on Michael's shirts and listened to Howl going through a spell with Michael. "I know I'm slapdash," he was saying, "but there's no need for you to copy me. Always read it right through first, then decide which bits mean what they say and which bits are a puzzle." Listening to Michael's replies, Sophie realized that she could learn too. When Howl took Michael into the yard, Sophie hobbled to the bench. The spell was clear enough, but Howl's scrawls defeated her. "I've never seen such writing," she grumbled to the skull. Howl was restless. Sophie heard him pacing during the night. He was only an hour in the bathroom the next morning. He seemed not to be able to contain himself, while Michael put on his best suit and set off to the palace in Kingsbury, after Howl turned the knob over the door, read down. "They're expecting it," Howl said. "And when you come back, I'll have a spell of power for you to work on." He shut the door and roved round the room. "My feet itch," he said suddenly. "I'm going for a walk. Tell Michael the spell is on the bench. And here's for you to keep busy with." A fancy grey and scarlet suit dropped into Sophie's lap from nowhere. Howl picked up his guitar, turned the doorknob green down, and stepped out among the scudding heather above Market Chipping. "His feet itch," grumbled Calcifer. "How does he think I feel stuck here?" "Then you'll have to give me a hint about how to break your contract," Sophie said, shaking out the grey and scarlet suit. "Goodness, you're a fine suit. Built to pull in the girls, aren't you?" "I have given you a hint," Calcifer fizzed. "Then you'll have to give it me again. I didn't catch it," Sophie said. She laid the suit down and hobbled to the door. Then she twisted the knob over the door until the black blob pointed downward and opened the door. There was nothing outside. It was neither black, nor grey, nor white. It was not thick or transparent. It did not move. When Sophie put a cautious finger out into it, it felt of nothing. "What is this?" she asked Calcifer. "I don't know," he said. "I only maintain it. It's on the side of the castle that no one can walk around. I can't really see outside. If you only knew how frustrating it is." Sophie shut the door and turned the knob green downward. She sat down and began mending Howl's suit. When Michael returned, his eyes went to the empty corner where the guitar usually stood. "Oh, no," he said. "Not the lady friend. I thought it was all over." Calcifer fizzed wickedly. "You got the signs wrong. Heartless Howl is finding this lady tough. He decided to leave her alone a few days to see if that would help." "Bother," said Michael. "I was hoping Howl was almost sensible again." Sophie banged the suit down. "Really?" she said. "How could you both talk like that about such wickedness? I can't blame Calcifer, since he's an evil demon, but Michael—" "I don't think I'm evil," Calcifer protested. "I'm not calm about it," Michael said. "If you knew the trouble we've had lawsuits and swords and mothers with rolling pins and fathers with cudgels and aunts. Aunts are terrible. They go for you with hatpins, but the worst is when the girl turns up crying. Howl goes out the back door, and Calcifer and I have to deal with them." "I hate the unhappy ones," Calcifer said. "They drip on me." "What does Howl do to these poor females?" Sophie said. "I was told he ate their hearts." Michael laughed uncomfortably. "Then you must come from Market Chipping. Howl sent me there to blacken his name when we first set up the castle. It's only true in a manner of speaking." "Howl's fickle," said Calcifer. He's only interested until the girl falls in love with him. Then he can't be bothered. But you can't get any sense out of him until he's made her love him, Michael said. Things get better then. Until they track him down, said Calcifer. But I think it's wicked, going round making poor girls unhappy, said Sophie. It's heartless and pointless. He's made that way, said Calcifer. When Howl came in at lunchtime, he was more discontented than ever. Hot water, Calcifer, he said. He stood moodily in the bathroom door a moment. Sophie, have you tidied this shelf by any chance? Nothing would possess Sophie to admit that she had gone through all those packets looking for pieces of girl. I haven't touched a thing, she replied virtuously. I hope you didn't, Michael said uneasily. Rinsings and gushings came from the bathroom. He's using a lot of hot water, Calcifer said. I think he's tinting his hair. I hope you left the hair spells alone. He's terribly vain. Oh, shut up, snapped Sophie. I put everything back where I found it. Sophie and Michael were clearing away lunch when the bathroom door crashed open and Howl shot out, wailing with despair. Look at this, he shouted. Look at it! What has that woman done? Sophie and Michael whirled round and looked at Howl. His hair was wet, but neither of them could see anything wrong. Howl sat down with a thump. Sophie, inspect. My hair is ruined. Michael and Sophie bent nervously over Howl's head. Maybe there was a slight, very slight, trace of red. I think it's very nice, Sophie said. Nice! Screamed Howl. Look at it! It's ginger! He spread his arms out passionately. Despair! Anguish! Horror! The room turned dim. Huge cloudy shapes bellied up in the corners. Howls began as moaning horror and went up to screams of pain and terror, becoming more horrible every second. Calcifer shrank down in the grate. Michael grabbed Sophie and dragged her to the door. He spun the knob to blew down and got them both outside as fast as he could. They hurried through the town, pursued by throbbing screams. They made for the harbour, where the grey vastness of the sea soaked it up a little. The noise became a gigantic sobbing that died away to vast sighs. When it seemed to be all over, they made their way back. Michael opened the door of the Port Haven house cautiously. Inside, Howl was sitting on the stool in an attitude of utter despair. And he was covered all over in thick, green slime. There were horrendous, dramatic quantities of green slime, oodles of it. It covered Howl completely. He draped his head and shoulders, heaping on his knees and trickling in glops down his legs. It was in oozing pools over the floor and creeping into the hearth. It smelled vile. Save me! Calcifer cried in a hoarse whisper. This will put me out! Sophie marched as near Howl as she could. Stop it at once. You're behaving like a baby. Howl did not answer. His face stared from behind the slime. Is he dead? Michael asked. Of course not, Sophie said. If it wasn't for Calcifer, he could behave like a jelly deal all day. Open the bathroom door. Sophie pushed Howl, stool and all, towards the bathroom. Her feet skidded in the slime, but the ooziness helped the stool to move. Michael pulled at Howl's sleeves. Together, they shunted him into the shower. It took an hour to wash the slime off. The blue and silver suit was ruined. Sophie told Michael to put it in the bath to soak. Meanwhile, she fetched more hot water. She turned the doorknob green down and swept all the slime out onto the moors where the castle left a trail like a snail. Sophie was tired and cross, and she was not prepared to be sympathetic when Michael finally led Howl from the bathroom, clothed in grey and scarlet. I can't get him to speak, Michael whispered miserably. It's a tantrum, Sophie said. She thrust a mugful of warm milk into Howl's hand. Drink. Now, what's all this fuss about? Is it a young lady? Howl sipped the milk dolefully. Yes, he said. I left her alone to see if that would make her remember me fondly. And now she tells me there's another. Sophie felt quite sorry for him. Now his hair was dry, she noticed guiltily. It was almost pink. How can she have another fellow? Howl went on. We usually get rid of the others when I come along. Sophie's sympathy shrank. Why don't you feed her a love potion and get it over with? Oh, no, said Howl. That would spoil the fun. Sophie's sympathy shrank again. Don't you ever give a thought for the poor girl? Howl gazed into the mug with a sentimental smile. I think of her all the time. Lovely, lovely Letty Hatter. Sophie lay awake and worried. She would tell Martha that her suitor was Wizard Howl. That would scare Martha off. And she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl was to announce she was in love with him, and perhaps threaten him with aunts. Next morning, Sophie could hear Howl singing in the bathroom as if he had never had a tantrum in his life. He tiptoed to the door, but Howl emerged before she reached it. I think my hair looks rather good this colour, he said. You indeed, grumped Sophie. It goes with this suit, said Howl. You have quite a touch with your needle. Huh, said Sophie. Has something annoyed you? Why should I be annoyed, said Sophie. Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic, deafened everyone in Port Haven, scared Calcifer to a cinder, and broke a few hundred hearts. Howl laughed. Ha 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 ha. I apologize, he said, turning the knob to red down. The king wants to see me. Tell Michael I left that spell on the bench. He smiled sunnily and stepped out into Kingsbury. And you think that makes it all right? Sophie growled as the door shut. But the smile had mollified her. If that smile works on me, no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind. Sophie set off to the door again, but Michael came running downstairs. I've got something urgent to see to, but I'll be back by evening, he said. He turned the doorknob green downward and jumped out onto the windy hillside. Botheration, said Sophie. She gave Michael time to get well on his way and set off for the door again. Somebody knocked on it. It's the castle door, Calcifer said, but I'm not sure. Sophie opened the door, and a turnip face leered inside. A ragged arm tried to paw at her. Calcifer! Sophie screamed. Make the castle go faster! She slammed the door. That was the scarecrow she had propped in the hedge. She had made jokes to it. Now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her here. Her heart gave a leap, then seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It was all she could do to get to the chair by the hearth. Is something the matter? Calcifer asked. Yes, my heart. There was a scarecrow at the door, Sophie gasped. What does a scarecrow to do with your heart? It was trying to get in. It gave me a terrible fright, and my heart... Oh, but you wouldn't understand, you silly demon. You haven't got a heart. Yes, I have, Calcifer said proudly. Down in the glowing part under the logs. Can I reduce the speed of the castle now? Has the scarecrow gone? Asked Sophie. I can't tell, said Calcifer. I told you, I can't really see outside. Sophie dragged herself to the door and looked out cautiously. The scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It's still there. Go faster. What a fuss, Calcifer grumbled. But he increased the castle's speed. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle. The skull clattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling into the bath. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out. The scarecrow was a black dot on a distant slope. Next time she looked, it was out of sight. Good. Then I shall stop for the night, said Calcifer. Sophie went and fished 6 packets in a bottle out of the bath. She laid them on the floor and cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labelled drying power. They were dry almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie tried the power on Howl's suit. That dried too, though it was stained green and rather smaller. Sophie felt cheerful enough to start supper. She bundled everything on the bench round the skull at one end and began chopping onions. "At least your eyes don't water, my friend," she told the skull. The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in fright, thinking it was the Scarecrow, but it was Michael. He dumped a pie and a pink and white striped box on top of the onion. "It's all right," he shouted joyfully. "Letty loves me. She's never even seen Howl. Last night I wished you'd dyed his hair blue. Anyway, I tore down to Market Chipping today, and it was all right. Howl must be after some other girl with the same name." "We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesare's, are we?" Sophie said. "Of course we are," Michael said. "I'm so relieved. I got you a cake to celebrate." "Are you sure your Letty was telling the truth?" Sophie asked anxiously. "Positive," said Michael. "I know when she's lying. She stops twiddling her thumbs." "She does too," said Sophie, chuckling. "How do you know?" Michael said. "Because she's my sister's granddaughter," said Sophie. Sophie was positive that the only other Letty Hatter in the district was the real one. It sounded like strong-minded Letty, not giving in to Howl. But why had Letty told Howl her real name? "Don't look so anxious," Michael laughed. "Look at the cake I bought you." Sophie opened the box. It was luscious, covered in cream and cherries and chocolate curls. The knob over the door clicked to red blob down, and Howl came in. "What a marvelous cake," he said. "Where did you get it?" "Cesare's," Michael said. "I've heard Cesare's is better than any cake shop in Kingsbury." "And is that pie?" Howl went to look. "Pie in a bed of raw onions? Human skull looking put upon?" He picked up the skull and knocked an onion ring out of its eye socket. "I see Sophie has been busy again. Couldn't you have restrained her, my friend?" The skull yattered its teeth. Howl looked startled and put it down. "Is something the matter?" Michael said. "There is," said Howl. "Calcifer, if we're not careful, the king's going to appoint me royal magician." Calcifer did not answer. He was asleep. "Calcifer!" Howl shouted. "Wake up!" One thick black cloud of smoke rolled up. "Go away," Calcifer grunted. "I'm tired." "I think it was the Scarecrow," Sophie said. Howl leveled his glass marble eyes at her. "What have you done now?" Sophie explained. "Calcifer agreed to speed up the castle because of a Scarecrow?" Howl said. "Sophie, please tell me how you bully a fire demon into being that obliging." "It gave me a turn and he was sorry for me," said Sophie. "It gave her a turn and Calcifer was sorry for her?" Howl repeated. "My good Sophie, I hope you enjoy raw onions and cold pie, because you've almost put Calcifer out." "There's the cake," Michael said, trying to make peace. Food improved Howl's temper. While they were eating, Michael asked Howl about the king. "He was sounding me out about his brother," Howl said. "The king obviously wanted me to volunteer to look for him, and I said I didn't think Wizard Sullivan was dead, which made matters worse." "Why do you want to slither out of looking for the prince?" Sophie demanded. "Don't you think you can find him?" "Rude as well as a bully, aren't you?" Howl said. "I want to get out of it because I know I can find him. Justin was buddies with Suleiman. He didn't think the king should have sent Suleiman to the waste. Now, even you must know there is a certain lady there who is very bad news. She sent a curse after me that I've only avoided so far because I gave her a false name." Sophie was almost bored. "You mean you tilted the Witch of the Waste?" Howl cut another lump of cake. "She is in some ways a very sad lady. Every man in Ingary is scared stiff of her. You ought to know how that feels, Sophie." Michael said quickly, "Should we move the castle?" "That depends on Calcifer. I must say, with the king and the witch both after me, I get a craving for planting the castle 1,000 miles away." Michael obviously wished he had not spoken. But what happens to your Letty Hatter if you up and move? Sophie said to Howl. I expect that will be all over by then, Howl said absently. If I could only get the king off my back. I know. He pointed his fork at Sophie. You can blacken my name. You can be my old mother and plead for your blue-eyed boy. He gave Sophie the smile which had no doubt charmed the witch of the waste, and Letty too. If you can bully Calcifer, the king should give you no trouble. Sophie said nothing. This was where she slithered out. Tomorrow she would go to Letty. To Sophie's relief, Calcifer blazed up bright and cheerful next morning. I thought she'd done for you, Howl said. I was only tired, Calcifer said. There was some kind of drag on the castle. I'd never taken it that fast before. Well, don't let her make you do it again, said Howl. Make a start on that spell today, Michael. I'm going to see Letty. He picked up his guitar and opened the door with the knob green down. The scarecrow was there. It pitched sideways across Howl with its turnip face in his chest. The guitar uttered an awful twang-oing. Sophie gave a squawk of terror. Howl got 1 foot up against the door frame and heaved. The scarecrow flew away backwards. It sprang up instantly and came hopping towards the castle again. Howl laid the guitar on the doorstep and jumped down to meet it. I'm afraid you'll have to go, Howl said. You scare Sophie, and there's no knowing what she'll do when she's scared. Come to think of it, you scare me too. Howl raised his arms above his head. He shouted out a strange word, half hidden in a crack of thunder, and the scarecrow went soaring away, up and out, on and on, until it was a vanishing point in the clouds. Howl mopped his face. I take back my hard words, Sophie, he panted. That thing had strong magic. Whatever was it? All that was left of the last person you cleaned for? Sophie gave a weak cackle of laughter. Her heart was behaving badly again. Howl took hold of her elbow and led her inside. Something happened between Howl and Calcifer then. Whatever it was, her heart began to behave properly at once. Howl gave Michael instructions, keeping Sophie quiet, then picked up the guitar and left. Sophie lay in a chair and pretended to feel twice as ill as she did. It was a nuisance Howl was going to Upper Folding, but the important thing was not to meet him. She watched Michael slyly while he scratched his head over the spell. When he seemed properly absorbed, Sophie got up. Terribly stuffy, she said, shambling to the door. Fresh air. Calcifer stopped the castle while she climbed out. She was almost at the road when Michael came bounding down the hillside. What are you doing? I'm perfectly all right, Sophie said. I'm simply going to see my other sister's granddaughter in Upper Folding. She's called Letty Hatter too. But that's over 10 miles away, Michael said. I promised Hal I wouldn't let you out of my sight. Huh, said Sophie. Besides, said Michael, slowly grasping the situation, Howl must have gone to Upper Folding. I'm sure he has, said Sophie. If Howl sees you, he'll be furious, Michael went on. Then, when Sophie was almost ready to hit him, he exclaimed, Wait! There's a pair of 7-league boots in the cupboard. He towed Sophie uphill to the castle. But 7 leagues is 21 miles, she panted. I'd be halfway to Port Haven in 2 strides. It's 10.5 miles a step, said Michael. That makes Upper Folding almost exactly. If we each take 1 boot and go together, then I won't be letting you out of my sight, and we'll get there before Howl. Sophie did not have the heart to protest. You're supposed to put your foot in them, shoe and all, Michael explained as he carried the 2 heavy, bucket-shaped things outside. We each put 1 foot in a boot. Point yourself towards Upper Folding before you put the boot down, Michael warned her. He and Sophie carefully swung themselves round. Now, tread. Zip! The landscape rushed past so fast it was only a blur. Then they were knee-deep in buttercups in the middle of Upper Folding Common. A cow stared at them. Unfortunately, the boot was so heavy that Sophie staggered as she landed. Don't put that foot down, Michael yelled, too late. There was another zipping blur, and Sophie found herself down the folding valley. Drat, he said, hopped carefully round, and tried again. Zip, blur. And she was back on the common, staggering forwards. She glimpsed Michael, diving to catch her. Zip, blur, bother, wailed Sophie. She was up in the hills with a castle drifting nearby. Sophie stumbled forwards again. Zip, zip. This time, Sophie visited in rapid succession the market square of Market Chipping and the front lawn of a grand mansion. And she was off again with another zip to a field somewhere. A large bull thoughtfully lured its horns. "I'm just leaving, my good beast," Sophie cried, hopping round frantically. Zip, back to the mansion. Zip, Market Square. Zip, and there was the castle again. She was getting the hang of it. Zip, up a folding. But how did you stop? Zip. "Oh, confound it," Sophie cried. Zip. The boot landed in a cow patch, and she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up and dragged the boot off. "Thank you," Sophie cried. "There seemed no reason why I should ever stop." They walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house. Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. Michael said, "This is Letty Hatter's great-aunt." "Oh, I thought the face looked familiar," Mrs. Fairfax exclaimed. "Do come in. Letty's busy, but have some scones and honey while you wait." She opened her front door wider. Instantly, a large collie dog squeezed past her skirts. "Oh, stop him!" Mrs. Fairfax gasped. There was a helter-skelter chase, in which the dog ran hither and thither, and Mrs. Fairfax and Sophie ran after the dog, and Michael ran after Sophie, crying, "Stop! You'll make yourself ill!" Then Michael made a dash through the flower beds and seized it by its thick coat just as it reached the orchard at the back of the house. Sophie hobbled up to find Michael pulling the dog backwards and making strange faces. He jerked his head towards the orchard. Howl was there with Letty. Howl was kneeling in the grass, holding one of her hands. Letty did not look like Martha at all, and her eyes shone with devotion for Howl. "He must have had a speed spell with him," Michael whispered. Mrs. Fairfax caught them up. "Bad dog," she whispered fiercely. The collie slunk away. "Thank you so much," Mrs. Fairfax said as they followed it. "You will keep trying to bite Letty's visitor." "He may have the right idea," Sophie said. "Mrs. Fairfax, do you know who Letty's visitor is?" Mrs. Fairfax chuckled. "Wizard Pendragon, or Howl, or whatever he calls himself. But Letty and I don't let on we know. It amused me when he first turned up, calling himself Sylvester Oak. He was my old tutor's last pupil before she retired. Mrs. Pentstemon was proud of him. She taught Wizard Suleiman, too, you know. And, but don't you know Howl's reputation?" Michael interrupted. "Most of it's just talk," he said. I said, "Letty, you could do worse than fall in love with Howl and let him be your teacher." Letty wasn't keen at first, but today it seems to be going beautifully. "But someone told me Letty was fond of someone else," said Sophie. "Sorry for him, you mean?" said Mrs. Fairfax. She lowered her voice. "There's a terrible disability there. A fearsomely strong spell. It's very sad. I can't break anything that's put on by the Witch of the Wake. Howl might. But of course, he can't ask Howl, can he?" Michael, who was now rather nervous, said, "I think we'd better be going." As they walked to the gate, Sophie asked, "Mrs. Fairfax, wasn't it my niece Martha who was supposed to come to you?" "Naughty girls," Mrs. Fairfax smiled. "But I'm not one to keep anyone against their will. I said, you stay as your own self or not at all. And it's worked out very happily." Michael collected the 7 league boots and set one down outside the gate for Sophie. "I'm going to hold on to you this time," he said. Both boots came down, and Mrs. Fairfax vanished in the zip. Michael went to the workbench to frown over his spell again. Sophie sat mending her stocking. "I wanted to laugh when that Mrs. Fairfax said she knew who Howl was, didn't you?" said Michael. "No," said Sophie. "I suppose there's no chance that Howl is properly in love this time?" Calcifer snorted green sparks up the chimney. I was afraid you'd start thinking that. Did he forget to spend an hour in the bathroom this morning? Michael asked Calcifer. He was in there 2 hours, said Calcifer. The day Howl forgets to do that will be the day I believe he's really in love, said Michael. Sophie knew they were right. She thought of tipping all Howl's beauty spells down the toilet, but she did not quite dare. Instead, she fetched the blue and silver suit and spent the rest of the day cutting little triangles out of it. Michael was having trouble with his spell. He gave up making notes and scraped some soot off the chimney. Then he took a withered root and put it in the soot. Then he turned the doorknob, blew down, and vanished into Port Haven. He came back with a large seashell and put that with the root and the soot. After that, he tore up paper and put those in too. He put the lot in front of the skull and stood blowing on it. What's he doing, do you think? Calcifer asked Sophie. Michael gave up blowing and started mashing everything with a pestle and mortar. I feel bad about spying on Howl, he announced as he pounded. He may be fickle, but he's been good to me. He took me in when I was an unwanted orphan. How did that come about? Asked Sophie. I slept on his doorstep until Howl opened the door one morning and I fell inside. He said I could wait while he got something to eat. I went in and there was Calcifer, and I started talking to him because I'd never met a demon before. I think Howl was impressed, but he didn't tell me I could stay. He just didn't tell me to go, so I started being useful. The spell gave a sort of woof and exploded mildly. Michael brushed soot off the skull, sighing, and tried new ingredients. Sophie began making a patchwork of blue triangles round her feet on the floor. I made lots of mistakes when I started, Michael went on. Howl was awfully nice about it, and I think I helped with money. Last winter, Howl went off and bought the skull and that stupid guitar. I was really annoyed. He said they looked good. Michael stared at his bowl of pounded stuff. I don't know. There should be 7 ingredients, but let's try it in a pentacle anyway. He put the bowl on the floor and chalked a 5-pointed star round it. The powder exploded with a force that blew Sophie's triangles into the heart. Michael swore and rubbed out the chalk. Sophie, he said, I'm stuck. Could you help me? Let's have a look, she said cautiously. I don't know anything about magic, you know. Michael thrust a strange grey paper into her hand. It looked unusual, even for a spell. It was printed in bold, slightly blurred letters. Sophie read, Go and catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to hear the mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. Decide what this is about. Write a second verse yourself. Sophie ploughed through it twice, not helped by Michael eagerly explaining. I decided that every line was a puzzle. I used soot with sparks in it for the falling star, and a seashell for the mermaid, and I thought I might count as a child. So I got a mandrake root down, and I wrote out lists of past years, and could the thing that stopped stinging be dockleaf? Anyway, none of it works. Very well, said Sophie. Let's start with decide what this is about. That ought to start things moving. No, it's the sort of spell that reveals itself as you do it, said Mike. That's what the last line means. It's very advanced. Let's ask Calcifer, Sophie suggested. No, I think Calcifer's part of the spell, Michael said. You can do it by yourself if you sit on everything I have to say, Sophie said. But the puzzle had got a grip on Sophie. She packed away her blue triangles and started making notes. Does garlic keep off envy? I could cut a star out of paper and drop it. Could we tell how? Do not think Howl's mind honest. He's Calcifer's. Where are past years? Must dry root bear fruit? Planted? Next to dock leaf? In seashell? Cloven hoof? Most things but horses. Shoe horse? With clove of garlic? Wind? Smell? Wind of 7-league boots? Is How, devil? Cloven toes in 7-league boots? Mermaids in boots? At last, Sophie said, Michael, let's try doing what it says. Where's the best place to catch a shooting star? Port Haven Marshes, Michael said. Can we? Shooting stars go awfully fast. So can we. In 7-league boots, Sophie pointed out. Michael sprang up. I think you've got it. Let's try. Michael was turning the doorknob blue down when two strange things happened. On the bench, the teeth of the skull started clattering, and Calcifer blazed up. I don't want you to go, he said. We'll be back soon, Michael said soothingly. It was a bright, balmy night. Sophie could see miles of flatness stretching in front of them. She could see bands of low bluish mist and pale glimmers of marshy pools. The sky was everywhere else. Michael and Sophie stood, each with a boot ready on the ground, waiting for one of the stars to move. Some hours later, Michael said, You go home, Sophie. It's my spell after all. Just as one of the stars came unstuck from the firmament and darted in a white streak down the sky. There's one! Sophie shrieked. Michael thumped his boot and was off, zip, squash, down in the marshes with mist and emptiness and dull glimmering pools. And there was the falling star. Sophie could see a little white descending flame shape a few yards beyond Michael. By the time Sophie caught up, Michael was stalking the star with soft steps. How odd, Sophie thought. It was made of light, and yet it had big, anxious eyes, peering back at Michael, and a small, pointed face. It cried out in a shrill voice, What do you want? I only want to catch you, Michael explained. No, no, the star crackled desperately. I'm supposed to die. But I could save you, if you'd let me catch you. No, cried the star. It dived away. Michael plunged, but it was too quick. There was a small, dying sizzle. When Sophie hobbled over, Michael was watching the last light fade out of a little round lump in a dark pool. Oh, that was sad, Sophie said. Michael sighed. Yes, let's go home. I hate giving in, but at least I'll get some sense out of Howl now this Letty Hatter's given in. This did not cheer Sophie up at all. Howl must have come back while Sophie and Michael were out. Dear Sophie, he said, why have you made a jigsaw puzzle of my best suit? Just a friendly inquiry. You jellied it, said Sophie. I'm making it over. I can do that, said Howl. I can also make you a pair of 7-league boots of your own. It's amazing the way one can take a step 10.5 miles long and still land in a cowpat. It may have been a bull pat, said Sophie. But I happened to tear my eyes from Letty's lovely face. I could have sworn I saw your long nose poking round the house, said Howl. Mrs. Fairfax is a family friend, said Sophie. How was I to know you'd be there? If I were to court a girl who lived on an iceberg, sooner or later I'd look up to see you swooping overhead on a broomstick, said Howl. Are you off to the iceberg today? Sophie retorted. From the look on Letty's face, there's nothing that need keep you there. You wrong me, Sophie, Howl said. Long years will pass before I leave Letty. I'm off to see the king today. Satisfied, Mrs. Nose? Sophie was not sure she believed this, though it was certainly to Kingsbury, for the doorknob read it down, that Howl departed after breakfast. Michael, since he had nothing to do, left for Cesare's. Sophie collected up all the little blue triangles of cloth and began guiltily sewing them back into the silver fishing net, which was all that was left of the suit. When someone knocked at the door, she started violently. Port Haven door, Calcifer said. It was a busy day. Sophie had to sell, with Calcifer's help, a spell to unblock drains, another to fetch goats, and something to make good beer. The only one that gave her trouble was a Kingsbury customer. Madam Sorceress, I have to fight a duel, he said. Give me something to make sure I win. Sophie looked at Calcifer, and Calcifer made faces. meaning that there was no such thing ready-made. That wouldn't be right at all, Sophie told the boy severely. Besides, dueling is wrong. Then give me something for a fair chance, the lad pleaded. He was very undersized and clearly in great fear. Sophie hobbled to the shelves and scanned the jars, then poured a generous heap of cayenne pepper on a square of paper. She stood the human skull beside it, took up a knife, and made what she hoped would look like mystic passes over the heap of pepper. Make it a fair fight, she mumbled. Sophie screwed the paper up and hobbled to the door with it. Throw this in the air when the duel starts, and it will give you the same chance as the other man. After that, it depends on you. The young man gave her a twopenny bit and went away whistling happily. I feel a fraud, Sophie said, stowing the money away, but I would like to be there at that fight. So would I, crackled Calcifer. When are you going to release me? When I've got a hint about this contract, Sophie said. You may get one later today, said Calcifer. Michael breathed in towards the end of the afternoon, singing cheerfully. He sat on the stool to tell her about his day, then he asked about Sophie. When Howl eventually shouldered the door open with his arm full of parcels, Michael was rolling around laughing at the duel spell. Look at you, Howl said. Ruin stares me in the face, this slave all day, and not one of you, even Calcifer, can spare time to say hello. Michael sprang up guiltily, and Calcifer said, I never do say hello. Is something wrong? Asked Sophie. How kind of you to ask, said Howl. Yes, something is wrong. The king has asked me officially to find his brother for him, with a strong hint that destroying the Witch of the Waste would come in handy. And you all sit there and laugh. It was clear that Howl was in a mood to produce green slime any second. Sophie put her sewing away. I'll make some toast, she said. No, don't get up, Howl said. I've trudged here, laden with stuff for you, so the least you can do is show polite interest. Here. He tipped parcels into Sophie's lap. Mystified, Sophie unwrapped several pairs of silk stockings, 2 fine petticoats, a pair of dove-grey suede boots, a lace shawl, and a dress of grey watered silk. Sophie gasped. Michael unwrapped a new velvet suit. You must have spent every penny we had, he said, ungratefully. I can't send you both to blacken my name to the king in rags, said Howl. Well, Sophie, are the boots the right size? Sophie looked up. Are you being kind or cowardly? Thank you very much, and no, I won't. What ingratitude, Howl exclaimed. Let's have green slime again, after which I shall be forced to move the castle 1,000 miles away and never see my lovely Letty again. Sophie glowered. You haven't asked me to do anything yet. You just said I'm going to. Howl smiled. And you are going to, aren't you? When do you want me to go? Sophie said. Tomorrow afternoon, said Howl. The king's expecting you. He began explaining very clearly just what Sophie was to say. There was no trace of the green slime mood now, Sophie noted. She wanted to slap him. I want you to do a very delicate job, so that the king will go on giving me work like transport spells. Explain what a good son I am, but in such a way that he'll understand I'm really quite useless. Michael, meanwhile, was trying to ask Howl about the perplexing spell. Not now, Michael. It occurred to me, Sophie, that you might want some practice in order not to find the palace overwhelming. So I arranged for you to pay a call to my old tutor, Mrs. Pentstemon. In some ways, she's grander than the king. At last, Howl turned to Michael. Right, what is it? Michael explained how impossible the spell seemed. Howl was astonished. He took the paper and stared at it. One of his eyebrows shot up. I tried doing it just as it says, Michael explained, but I couldn't catch the falling star. Great gods above, Howl exclaimed. But this isn't the spell I left. Where did you find it? On the bench, in that heap of things round the skull, said Michael. Sophie strikes again, Howl said. I might have known. No, the proper spell's not here. He tapped the skull thoughtfully on its brown dome. You're doing, friend? I have a notion you come from there. I'm sure the guitar does. Sophie, dear, am I right in thinking that you turned my doorknob black side down and stuck your long nose out through it? Just my finger, Sophie said with dignity. But you opened the door, said Howl. And the thing Michael thinks is a spell must have got through. What is it really? Michael said. Howl gave a snort of laughter. Decide what this is about. Write a second verse. I'll show you, he said, and pounded upstairs. Moments later, he came charging back. I haven't got that book after all. He seemed upset now. Michael, did you say you tried to catch a shooting star? Yes, but it drowned, Michael said. It was very sad, Sophie said. It was your idea, was it? Said Howl. It would be. It'd have been more than sad if he'd caught the thing. Calcifer flickered up the chimney. What's all this fuss about? He demanded. You caught one yourself, didn't you? Yes, and I... Howl began, but he pulled himself together. Michael, promise me you'll never try to catch one again. I promise, Michael said. What is that writing if it's not a spell? Howl looked at the grey paper. It's called Song. But it's not all here, and I can't remember the rest. A new thought struck him, one that worried him. I think the next verse was important. He went to the door and turned the knob black down. He looked round at them. I know Sophie will squirm through somehow if I leave her behind. Now come along, both of you. He opened the door on the nothingness and walked into it. Sophie shed parcels right and left into the hearth as she sprang up. Don't get any sparks on those, she said to Calcifer. If you promise to tell me what's there, Calcifer said. You had your hint, by the way. Did I? Said Sophie. She was in too much of a hurry to attend. The nothingness was only inch thick. Beyond it, in a grey, drizzling evening, was a path to a garden gate. Sophie looked back and found the castle had become a house. We need to be dressed in keeping with this place, Howl said, his finery blurred. When it came into focus again, it was still scarlet and grey, but quite a different shape. Michael's jacket had become a waist-length padded thing. He stared at the tight blue things encasing his leg. I can hardly bend my knee, he said. You'll get used to it, said Howl. Come on. Howl led the way back up the path towards the house. The back of his baggy jacket, Sophie saw, had mysterious words on it. Welsh rugby. Sophie looked down at herself and saw twice as much skinny legs showing above her knobby shoes. Otherwise, not much had changed. Howl unlocked the wavy glass door. There seemed to be people in the house. Loud voices were coming from behind the door. When Howl opened that door, Sophie realized that the voices were coming from magic-colored pictures moving on the front of a big square box. Howl! Exclaimed a woman who was sitting there. A small girl leapt up. Uncle Howl! She screamed and wrapped herself around him. Mary! Howl bawled in reply. How are you, Cariad? In between bursts of chatter, Howl managed to say, This is my niece Mary and my sister Megan. Howl, are you staying long? Said Megan. Just dropped in, Howl said, lowering Mary to the floor. I want to ask you something that may sound silly. Has Neil, by any chance, lost a piece of English homework lately? Funny you should say that, Megan exclaimed. Looking everywhere for it he was. He's got this new English teacher, see, puts the fear of God into them. So here he is on Thursday, hunting high and low, and all he can find is a funny old piece of writing. Ah, said Howl. What did he do with that? I don't know. Better ask Neil. He's in the front bedroom, said Megan. Howl led Michael and Sophie upstairs. Two boys were crouched over various magic boxes on a big table. The main magic box had a glass front, like the one downstairs, but it seemed to be showing writing and diagrams. Neil, said Howl. Don't interrupt, one of the boys said. He'll lose his life. Howl, quite unperturbed, strode over to the wall and pulled the boxes up by the roots. The picture vanished. Neil whirled round and glowered at Howl. What do you want? Put that plug back in. I'll put it back when I've asked you something, and you've answered, said Howl. Neil sighed. Uncle Howl, I'm in the middle of a computer game. A new one? Asked Howl. No, it's one I had for Christmas. Then that's easy, said Howl. I'll bribe you with a new one. Can you make another one of those that nobody else has got? Neil said eagerly. Yes, but look at this first and tell me what it is, Howl said, and he held the shiny grey paper out. Hey, it's my long-lost homework, exclaimed Neil. Where did you find it? Was that funny writing yours? Miss Angorian said it was interesting and took it home. Thank you, said Howl. Where does she live? That flat over Mrs. Phillips's tea shop, said Neil. Howl felt in one baggy pocket and handed him a flat packet. Thanks, Neil said, and whirled round to his magic boxes. Howl planted the bundle of roots back in the wall and hurried away to the stairs. Neil was reading aloud. You are in an enchanted castle with 4 doors. Each opens on a different dimension. In Dimension 1, the castle is moving constantly. Sophie hobbled to the stairs. She found Michael halfway down, looking embarrassed. Howl was at the foot of the stairs, arguing with his sister. What do you mean you sold all my books? Howl was saying. I'm not a storehouse for your property, Megan answered. You're a disgrace to me and Gareth, lounging about in those clothes instead of buying a suit and looking respectable, taking up with riffraff and layabouts. You had all that education and you just hang around, wasting your money. Megan's voice went on and on. Sophie began to understand how Howl had acquired the habit of slithering out. Never getting a job I could be proud of, coming here and spoiling Mary Rotten, Megan ground on. Sophie pushed Michael aside and stumped downstairs. Come, Howl, she said grandly. We must be on our way. While we stand here, money is ticking away and your servants are probably selling the gold plate. So nice to meet you, she said to Megan, but we must rush. Megan gulped a bit. Sophie gave her a stately nod and pushed Howl towards the door. Is my old car still in the shed? What have you sold that to? Howl asked. You've got the only keys, Megan answered dourly. Sophie hated the next bit. They rode in a carriage without horses that went at a terrifying speed, smelling and growling as it tore down steep roads. She shut her eyes and clung on, hoping it would be over soon. They arrived beside a large window displaying a notice that said, Teas closed. Howl pressed a button beside the window and Miss Angorian opened the door. They all stared. For a fierce schoolteacher, Miss Angorian was astonishingly young and good-looking. She had sheets of blue-black hair hanging round her heart-shaped face and enormous dark eyes. I'll take a guess that you may be Howl Jenkins, Miss Angorian said. Howl was taken aback. Then his smile snapped on. And you must be Miss Angorian. I'm sorry to bother you, but I made a stupid mistake last week and carried off my nephew's English homework instead of a rather important paper. I gather Neil gave it to you. He did, said Miss Angorian. You'd better come in. They all trooped upstairs to Miss Angorian's tiny, severe living room. You seem to have caused a lot of gossip in this town, Miss Angorian said, sorting through papers. And what are those people who gossip told you? Howl asked, trying to catch Miss Angorian's eye. That you disappear and turn up rather unpredictably, for one thing, Miss Angorian said. What else? Many things. Few of them to your credit. She held a yellowish, wavy-edged paper out to Howl. Yeah. You know what it is? Of course, said Howl. He took the paper. There was a bit of a scuffle as he tried to take Miss Angorian's hand, too. Miss Angorian put her hands behind her back. Howl smiled meltingly and passed the paper to Michael. You tell her. Michael's face lit up. It's the spell! Oh, I can do this one. It's enlargement, isn't it? I'd like to know what you were doing with such a thing, Miss Angorian said accusingly. Miss Angorian, said Howl, if you have heard all those things about me, you must know I wrote my doctoral thesis on charms and spells. You look as if you suspect me of work in black magic. I assure you, I never worked any kind of spell in my life. Sophie could not stop herself snorting at this blatant lie. This spell is for study purposes, Howl added, giving Sophie an irritated frown. It's very old and rare. That's why I wanted it back. Well, you have it, Miss Angorian said crisply. Would you mind giving me my homework sheet in return? Photocopies cost money. Howl brought out the grey paper. This poem's been bothering me. I can't remember the rest of it. By Walter Raleigh, isn't it? Miss Angorian gave him a withering look. It's by John Donne. I have the book with it in here. Howl's eyes followed Miss Angorian as she went to her book. Miss Angorian, he said pleadingly, would you consider coming out for some supper with me tonight? Miss Angorian looked more severe than ever. I would not. Mr. Jenkins, I still consider myself engaged to Ben Sullivan. Never heard of him, said Howl. My fiancé, said Miss Angorian. He disappeared some years back. Do you wish me to read the rest of this poem out? Do that, Howl said. You have such a lovely voice. If thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights, till age snow-white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou returnest, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. Howl had gone a terrible white. Thank you, he said. Stop there. Even the good woman is untrue in the last verse, isn't she? I remember now. He forced a smile. We must be going. Howl hustled Michael and Sophie downstairs and into the horrible, horseless carriage. What's the matter? Michael asked when they were back at the house. Oh, nothing, Howl said airily. He seemed to be calculating in his head. 10,000, Sophie heard him murmur. That brings it to about Midsummer Day. What is brought to Midsummer Day? Asked Sophie. The time I'll be 10,000 days old, Howl said. And that, Mrs. knows, is the day I should have to go back to the Witch of the Waste. Sophie and Michael stared. If I keep clear of mermaids, they heard him mutter, and don't touch a mandrake root, Sophie asked, what will the witch do? I shudder to think, Howl said. He opened the wavy glass door. Inside was the familiar room of the castle. She caught up, old blue face, he said. I know, said Cassifer. I felt it take. The following afternoon, Sophie put on her new clothes and sat waiting for Howl to finish in the bathroom. While she waited, she told Calcifer about the strange country where Howl's family lived. Calcifer was very interested. Sounds like another world, he said. Clever of the witch to send the curse in from there. Calcifer moved his orange eyes to look into Sophie. I'm scared too. I shall suffer with Howl if the witch catches him. Then I won't be able to help you. Howl came dashing out of the bathroom, looking his very finest, scenting the room with roses and yelling for Michael. Sophie collected her trusty stick. It was time to go. By the way, Howl said, Mrs. Pentstemon will call you Mrs. Pendragon. Pendragon's the name I go under here. Mrs. Pentstemon's house was near the end of a narrow street. The door was opened by an elderly footman in black velvet. Howl treated the footman as an old friend and made jokes to him. The footman passed them on to a page boy in red velvet. Sophie began to see why this made good practice for meeting the king. The boy ushered them into a drawing room, where everything was blue and gold and white and fine. Mrs. Pentstemon was finest of all. She was tall and thin, and sat bolt upright in a blue and gold chair, supporting herself with one hand on a gold-topped cane. She was the most frightening lady Sophie had ever seen. "My dear Howl," she said, holding out a gold mesh mitten. Howl kissed the mitten. "Mrs. Pentstemon, allow me to present my mother." "Charmed," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "Pray sit down, both of you." Trying not to shake, Sophie sat in the embroidered chair opposite Mrs. Pentstemon. "I'm 86, Mrs. Pentstemon announced. "How old are you, Mrs. Pendragon?" 90, Sophie invented. "How lucky you are to move so nimbly still." "Oh, she's wonderfully nimble," Howl agreed. "Sometimes there's no stopping her." Mrs. Pentstemon gave him a look. "I am talking to your mother. I dare say she is as proud of you as I. You are our joint creation." "Don't you think I did any of me myself, then?" Howl asked. "Put in some touches of my own?" "A few, and those not altogether to my liking," Mrs. Pentstemon replied. "Now go down and sit on the terrace with your page boy. Go along." If Sophie had not been so nervous, she might have laughed at Howl's expression. He had obviously not expected this, but he got up, made a slight, warning face at Sophie, and shooed Michael out of the room. Mrs. Pentstemon turned towards Sophie. "That boy Howl is going to the bad, Mrs. Pendragon," she announced. "Oh," said Sophie, wondering why Mrs. Pentstemon said going. Howl had surely arrived at the bad long ago. "Take his appearance," Mrs. Pentstemon said. "What call has he to be walking around in a charmed suit? It is barely detectable even to my trained eye, since it appears to have been darned into the seams. It renders him almost irresistible to ladies. This represents a downward trend into black arts, which must cause you motherly concern, Mrs. Pendragon." Sophie thought uneasily about the grey and scarlet suit. She had darned the seams without noticing anything. Mrs. Pentstemon stared into Sophie's eye. "My life is nearly over. I thought my work was done when I trained Benjamin Sullivan, whom you probably know better as Wizard Suliman, rest his soul, and procured him the post of Royal Magician. Then Howl came, and I saw that he had twice the imagination and abilities. Though he had some faults of character, I knew he was a force for good." "Good, Mrs. Pendragon. But what is he now?" "What indeed?" Sophie said. "Something has happened to him," Mrs. Pentstemon said, "and I am determined to put that right." "What do you think has happened?" Sophie asked uncomfortably. "I must rely on you to tell me that," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "My feeling is that he has gone the same way as the Witch of the Waste. Those of high ability often cannot resist some extra dangerous stroke of cleverness, resulting in a fatal flaw and a slow decline to evil. Do you have a clue what it might be?" Sophie felt a little chilly. "Yes," she said. "He's made some sort of contract with his fire demon." "I have been looking at you, Mrs. Pendragon." "And I like your gift," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "It brings life to things, such as that stick in your hand, which you have evidently talked to the extent that it has become what the layman would call a magic wand. I think you would not find it too hard to break that contract." "I need to know what the terms are," Sophie said. "Did Howl tell you I was a witch? Because if he did, he did not. You can rely on my experience to know these things," said Mrs. Pentstemon. She shut her eye. "I now see that the witch made a contract with a fire demon, and over the years, that demon has taken control of her. Demons do not understand good and evil, but they can be bribed into a contract. This prolongs the life of both human and demon, and the human also gets the demon's magic power. Mrs. Penstemon opened her eyes. Now I must bid you farewell. I have to rest. And like magic, which it probably was, the door opened, and the page boy came to usher Sophie out. Sophie was extremely glad to go. Mrs. Penstemon had said Sophie was a witch. Oddly enough, Sophie accepted this without any trouble. It was as if Sophie had always known, but she had thought it was not proper to have a magic gift, because she was the eldest of 3. Then she thought of the grey and scarlet suit, and nearly fell downstairs. She was the one who had charmed it. Built to pull in the girls, she had told it, and of course it did. It had charmed Letty in the orchard. It must have had its effect on Miss Angorian, too. Oh dear, Sophie thought, I must get that suit off him. Howl was waiting in the hall with Michael. You seem a bit ragged, he said. You'd better skip the king. I'll go and blacken my own name. I'll say my wicked ways have made you ill. Sophie certainly did not wish to see the king, but if the witch caught Howl, Sophie's own chance of being young again would have gone too. She shook her head. After Mrs. Penstemon, the King of Ingery will seem just like an ordinary person. The palace entrance was up a huge flight of steps. Then there were archways, halls, corridors, one after another. At every archway a splendidly dressed person inquired their business and led them on to the next. About halfway, Howl was politely detached and told to wait. Michael and Sophie were taken upstairs and handed on again until they came to an anteroom. There Michael was peeled off, and Sophie was ushered through huge double doors. An echoing voice announced, Your Majesty, Mrs. Pendragon! And there was the king, sitting in a square chair with only a little gold leaf on it. He said, Well, why does Wizard Howl's mother wish to see me? And Sophie suddenly found she had forgotten every word of the careful, delicate things Howl wanted her to say. He sent me to tell you he's not going to look for your brother, she said. Your Majesty. Are you sure? Asked the king. The wizard seemed willing when I talked to him. Sophie remembered that she was here to blacken Howl's name, so she said, He lied. He's a slitherer outer, Your Majesty. And he hopes to slither out of finding Justin, said the king. I see. Won't you sit down and tell me the wizard's reasons? Sophie creaked into a chair and sat with her hands propped on her stick like Mrs. Penstemon. She said, Only a coward would send his mother along to plead for him. You can see what he's like, Your Majesty. I told him that I'd make it worth his while, the king said. Oh, he doesn't care about money, Sophie said. But he's scared stiff of the Witch of the Waste. She put a curse on him, and it's caught up. Then he has reason to be scared, the king said. Sophie thought desperately. I have to blacken his name. He's fickle, careless, and hysterical. Half the time I think he doesn't care what happens as long as he's all right. But then I find out how kind he's been to someone. I don't know, Your Majesty. He's a mess. My impression was that Howl is an unprincipled rogue with a glib tongue and a clever mind, said the king. Would you agree? How well you put it, Sophie said. But you left out how vain he is and... She looked suspiciously at the king. The king was smiling. Thank you, Mrs. Pendragon, he said. Your outspokenness has taken a weight off my mind. The wizard agreed to look for my brother so readily that I feared he was either unable to resist showing off or would do anything for money. But you have shown me he's just the man I need. Oh, confound it, Sophie cried. He sent me to tell you he wasn't. And so you did. The king leaned toward Sophie. Mrs. Pendragon, Justin is a brilliant general, and I can't do without him. And I need a clever, unscrupulous wizard to get him back. Howl will run away, Sophie said. No, don't think he will. He sent you to show me he was too much of a coward to care what I thought of him. But no one would do that, except as a last resort, which shows me that Wizard Howl will do what I want if I make it clear that his last resort has failed. King smiled again. Tell Howl I'm appointing him royal wizard, with our royal command to find Prince Justin, alive or dead, before the year is out. Sophie levered herself up and gave a creaking curtsy. It seemed the right thing to do. Oh, curses, she muttered. It was exactly what Howl did not want. Howl would now move the castle 1,000 miles away. Letty, Martha, and Michael would all be miserable, and no doubt there would be torrents of green slime. It comes of being the eldest. You just can't win. In her annoyance, Sophie had somehow come out through the wrong double doors. A courtier hastened up to her and bowed. He was rather undersized, and Sophie stared at him. Oh, good gracious, so the spell worked. It did indeed, smiled the courtier. I disarmed him while he was sneezing, and he is now suing me. But the important thing is that my dear Jane came back to me. A thought struck Sophie. Are you by any chance the Count of Cataract? At your service, he replied, bowing. He took Sophie to an attendant, and she eventually hobbled her way down to the entrance. Michael was not there, nor was Howl. By now she was so tired and hot and dejected that she decided not to wait. She hobbled down the grand staircase. She hobbled down a grand avenue. She stumped along another and realized she was lost. She did not even know the way back to the palace. Sophie hobbled on hopelessly. She was near giving up when she passed the end of the narrow street where Mrs. Pentstemmon's house was. Ah, she thought, I can go and ask the footman. So she turned down the street. The Witch of the Waste was coming up it towards her. There's no reason she should remember me, Sophie thought, stumping boldly on. That was a mistake. The witch came floating up the street, smiling. Why, it's Miss Hatter, she laughed. I never forget a face, particularly if I've made it myself. If you're thinking of calling on Mrs. Pentstemon, you can save yourself that trouble. The old biddy's dead. Dead? Said Sophie. Yes, dead, said the witch. She refused to tell me where someone was. She said, over my dead body, so I took her as her word. She's looking for Howl, Sophie thought. Now what do I do? I don't know who this person is, she said, but that makes you a wicked murderess. But you were going to call on Mrs. Pentstemon, said the witch. No, said Sophie. You said that. I don't have to know her to call you wicked for killing her. Then where were you going? I'm going to see the king, Sophie said. The witch laughed disbelievingly. But will the king see you? Yes, of course, Sophie declared. I'm going to petition him for better conditions for hatters. Then you're going in the wrong direction, said the witch. The palace is behind you. Oh, is it? Said Sophie. She did not have to pretend to be surprised. The witch laughed heartily. I'll show you the way. There seemed nothing Sophie could do but turn round and stump beside the witch. Why did you make me like this? She demanded as they went. You were preventing me getting some information, the witch said. Though I dare say you had no idea. Have you heard of a land called Wales? No, said Sophie. Is it under the sea? The witch found this funnier than ever. It's where Wizard Howl comes from. You know Wizard Howl, don't you? By hearsay, Sophie lied. He's as wicked as you. There's the palace, said the witch. Are you sure you can manage all those stairs? Make me young again, and I'll run up them, said Sophie. That wouldn't be half so funny, said the witch. Up you go. Sophie looked hopelessly up the long flight of stairs. Since the witch was obviously going to stand and watch, Sophie had no choice but to climb them. Up she hobbled, hating the witch more with every step. The guards let her inside. Before Sophie had collected her wits, the palace machinery was in motion again, and she was being handed from person to person until she arrived at the double doors. It's like a bad dream, Sophie thought. The king was standing at a large desk, anxiously moving flags about on a map. He looked up. "They tell me there was something you forgot to say." "Yes," said Sophie. "Howl says he'll only look for Prince Justin if you promise him your daughter's hand in marriage." What put that into my head, she thought. "Mrs. Pendragon, you must know that's quite out of the question," said the king. "Please come and sit down. You seem tired." Sophie sank into a low chair, wondering when the guards would arrive to arrest her. "My daughter was here just now," said the king. To Sophie's surprise, he bent and called under the desk. "Valeria, come on out. There's a good girl." There was a shuffling noise. After a second, Princess Valeria emerged, grinning. She had 4 teeth. When she saw Sophie, she reached out, took hold of Sophie's dress, and hauled herself to her feet. "Oh," said Sophie, feeling an awful fool. Sophie rode back to the castle's Kingsbury entrance in a coach drawn by 4 horses. On it also were a coachman, a groom, and a footman. A sergeant and 6 royal troopers went with it to guard it. The reason was Princess Valeria. She had climbed into Sophie's lap. The equipage drew to a noisy halt, and Michael shot out of the door. "Where did you get to?" he said. "Howl's terribly upset." "I'm sure he is," Sophie said. "Because Mrs. Pentstemmon's dead," said Michael. Howl was holding a scroll with royal seals dangling off it, which Sophie eyed guiltily. "I make that 4 horses and 10 men to get rid of 1 old woman. What did you do to the king?" Sophie expected to find the room covered with green slime, but it wasn't. "I think the king got sick of me blackening your name. I went twice. Everything went wrong. And I met the witch on her way from killing Mrs. Pentstemon. What a day!" "Behold the new royal wizard," said Howl, dangling the scroll. "My name is very black." Then he began to laugh. "I did blacken your name," Sophie protested. "I know." "It was my miscalculation," Howl said. "Now, how am I going to go to Mrs. Pentstemon's funeral without the witch knowing?" Next morning, Howl went out early, and the doorknob was turned green down. "Don't open the door to anyone," Calcifer said. "The witch knows about all the entrances except the Port Haven one." This so alarmed Michael that he fetched some planks from the yard and wedged them over the door. Half an hour later, there came a violent explosion, and Howl stormed in. "This is a bit much, Sophie," he said. "I do live here." He was soaking wet. Sophie looked at the doorknob, turned to black down. Miss Angorian, she thought. And he went in that charmed suit. "Where have you been?" Howl sneezed. "None of your business. Calcifer, I need a hot drink." Calcifer plunged down among his logs. "Don't come near me like that. You're wet," he hissed. "Sophie," Howl pleaded. Sophie folded her arms. "What about Letty?" she said. "Bother you," said Howl. He shook himself. The water fell off in a neat ring on the floor. "The world is full of hard-hearted women, Michael. I can name 3 instantly." "One of them being Miss Angorian?" asked Sophie. Howl did not answer. He ignored Sophie grandly for the rest of the morning, while he discussed moving the castle with Michael and Calcifer. "I don't think we need move the Port Haven entrance," Howl said. "But I want the moving castle well away and the Kingsbury entrance shut down." "What about the Black Down entrance?" Michael asked. "That stays," Howl said. It would, Sophie thought. Howl kept on sneezing. "Why is it whenever I go to Wales, I always come back with a cold?" he croaked, conjuring himself a wad of tissues. Sophie snorted. "Did you say something?" "I was thinking that people who are appointed to do something by the king and go courting in the rain instead have only themselves to blame," Sophie said. "You don't know everything I do, Mrs. Moralizer. I have looked for Prince Justin." "When have you looked?" said Sophie. "Oh, how your long nose twitches," Howl croaked. "When he first disappeared, I was curious to know what Prince Justin was doing up this way. when everyone knew Suleiman had gone to the waste. Someone must have sold him a dud-finding spell, because he went right over into the Folding Valley and bought another from Mrs. Fairfax. And that fetched him back this way, where he stopped at the castle, and Michael sold him another finding spell. Michael's hand went over his mouth. Was that man in the green uniform Prince Justin? Yes. But I didn't mention it before, because the king might have thought you should have had the sense to sell him another dud. I had a conscience about it. Conscience. Notice that word, Mrs. Longnose. Howl conjured another wad of handkerchiefs and glowered. Then he stood up. I feel ill. I'm going to bed, where I may die. Bury me beside Mrs. Pentstemon. He tottered piteously upstairs. Howl's voice was presently heard shouting weakly, I'm dying from neglect. Michael left off working on his spell and ran upstairs. In the time it took Sophie to sew 10 blue triangles, Michael ran upstairs with lemon and honey, a book, cough mixture, with a spoon to take the cough mixture, and then with nose drops, throat pastils, and gargle. By this time, Sophie was becoming worried about the blue and silver suit. It was getting smaller and smaller. Michael, she said, is there a way of making small clothes larger? Oh, yes, said Michael. That's what my new spell is, when I get a chance to work on it. They had bacon sandwiches for lunch, but Michael had to rush upstairs in the middle of eating his. He came down with the news that Howl wanted him to go into market shipping. Michael dived into the cupboard and came out with a velvet cloak slung round his shoulders. At least, the person who came out was a burly man with a red beard. This person said, with Michael's voice, Howl thinks I'll be safe enough like this. He opened the door, green down, and jumped out. Peace descended. Sophie got up and cautiously hobbled to the broom cupboard. This was her chance to go and see Letty. The 7-league boots were not there. Rat the man, Sophie exclaimed. She was closing the cupboard when someone knocked at the door. Sophie jumped and hoped they would go away, but this person seemed more determined than most. Is it the witch? Sophie asked Calcifer. No, said Calcifer. His blue face looked puzzled. I'm not sure what it is. I don't think it means any harm. Sophie opened the door. A huge, spindly greyhound leapt off the hillside and landed in the middle of the room. Sophie backed away hurriedly. The dog somehow hoisted itself onto its hind legs and heaved upward. Then it made an enormous effort and surged into the shape of a man. He had gingerish hair and a pale, unhappy face. Came from Upper Folding, panted this dog-man. Love Letty. Letty sent me. Unhappy. Told me stay. He began to shrink and gave a howl of annoyance. Don't tell Wizard! He whined, dwindling into a dog again. This time he seemed to be a red setter. The red setter waved its fringed tail and stared earnestly from miserable eyes. Oh dear, said Sophie. You were that collie dog, weren't you? Now I see what Mrs. Fairfax was talking about. But why has Letty sent you here? If you don't want me to tell Howl, the dog growled faintly. All right, I won't, Sophie promised. The dog trotted to the hearth and lay down. Calcifer, what do you think? This dog is a bespelled human, Calcifer said unnecessarily. But can you take the spell off? Sophie asked. No. I'd need to be linked with Howl for that, Calcifer said. Then I'll try, Sophie said. She laid her hand on the dog's soft, rounded head. Turn back into the man you should be, she said. But the only effect seemed to be to send the dog deeply to sleep. Meanwhile, a certain amount of moaning and groaning was coming from upstairs. A loud coughing followed. Hoot! Hoot! Went a blown nose. The coughing started again, mingled with moans, and the sounds rose until Howl seemed to be managing to cough, groan, blow his nose, sneeze, and wail gently, all at the same time. All right, Sophie said. It'll be green slime next. She climbed the stairs, muttering loudly. You'd think no one had ever had a cold before. I'm dying of boredom, Howl said pathetically. Or maybe just dying. Sophie felt his forehead. You do have a bit of a fever. I'm delirious, said Howl. Spots are crawling before my eyes. Those are spiders, said Sophie. Why can't you cure yourself with a spell? Because there is no cure for a cold, Howl said dolefully. Things are going round and round in my head. I keep thinking of the witch's curse. I keep waiting for the rest to happen. Sophie thought back to the puzzling verse. What thing? Tell me where all the past years are. Oh, I know that, said Howl. So just where they always were. I could go and play bad fairy at my own christening if I wanted. Maybe I did. No. There are only 3 things I'm waiting for. The mermaids, the mandrake root, and the wind to advance an honest mind. There's only about 3 weeks left for them to come true in, and the witch gets me when they do. But the rugby club reunion is Midsummer Eve, so I shall get to that at least. The rest all happened long ago. You mean the falling star? And never being able to find a woman true and fair? Said Sophie. I'm not surprised the way you go on. Mrs. Pentstemon told me you were going to the bad. Mrs. Pentstemon always thought far too well of me, Howl said sadly. Water ran out of his eyes. Sophie had no idea if he was really crying or whether it was his cold. He was slithering out again. I was talking about the way you keep dropping ladies as soon as you've made them love you, she said. Why do you do it? If at first you don't succeed, try again. I keep trying, but I brought it on myself by making a bargain, and I know I shall never be able to love anyone properly now. There was a pattering outside, and the dog man oozed himself past the door. Sophie reached out and caught a handful of his red coat, thinking he was coming to bite Howl, but the dog just leaned against her legs, making her stagger backwards. What's this? Said Howl. My new dog, Sophie said. Now she could see out of the bedroom window. It showed a neat garden. As Sophie stared, Howl's niece, Mary, came running across the grass. Is that the place called Wales? Sophie asked. Howl laughed. Bother that dog, he croaked. I was sure I could keep you from snooping out of the window while you were in here. Did you now? Said Sophie. So all that song and dance was just a game. I might have known. Howl lay back, looking wronged and injured. Sometimes you sound just like Megan. Sometimes I understand how Megan got the way she is, Sophie answered, and she shut the door with a bang. The red-bearded man returned, carrying a box of things, and shed his velvet cloak to become Michael. Howl arrived downstairs, wrapped in the bed cover. Well, Howl croaked. I got everything, said Michael. And there's a shop for sale in Market Chipping. It used to be a hat shop. Could we move the castle there? It depends, Howl said. I'm tempted to move the Porthaven entrance there. That won't be easy, because it will mean moving Calcifer. Porthaven is where Calcifer actually is. What do you say, Calcifer? It will take a very careful operation to move me, Calcifer said. He became several shades paler at the thought. So Fanny is selling the shop, Sophie thought. And so much for the conscience Howl said he had. Howl was in and out of bed all the next day. When he was in bed, Michael had to tear up and down the stairs. When he was up, Michael had to race about, measuring the castle and fixing metal brackets. In between, Howl kept appearing, robed in his cloak, to ask questions. Sophie sat sewing in her 70th blue triangle. Sophie, if we were to take that shop, what would we sell? Sophie found she had had enough of hats to last a lifetime. Not hats, she said. You can buy the shop, but not the business. Apply your fiendish mind to the matter, said Howl. And he marched away upstairs. 5 minutes later, down he came again. Have you any preferences about the other entrances? Sophie found her mind going to Mrs. Fairfax's house. "I'd like a nice house with lots of flowers," she said. "I see," croaked Howl, and marched away again. Next time he appeared, he was dressed. Howl put on the velvet cloak Michael had used, and became a pale, coughing, red-bearded man with a large red handkerchief. He went out with the doorknob green down. For an hour, Michael had time to work on his spell. Sophie got as far as her 84th blue triangle. Then the red-bearded man was back again. He shed the velvet cloak and became Howl, coughing harder than before and more sorry for himself than ever. "I took the shop," he said, and he went upstairs to bed. Sophie began on her 85th triangle. Michael was happy. "We're going to live in Market Chipping," he said. "I can go and see my Letty every day. I told her." He was interrupted by Howl, trailing downstairs in his quilt again. "Mrs. Pentstemon is being buried tomorrow, and I shall need this suit cleaned." He dropped the grey and scarlet suit on Sophie's lap. "I haven't the energy to clean it myself." "You don't need to go to the funeral, do you?" Michael said anxiously. "Your cold's worse." Howl coughed piteously. "I shall go in disguise, probably as another corpse," he said, trailing back upstairs. "Then you need a winding sheet," Sophie called after him. She now had the charmed suit in her hands, and it was too good a chance to miss. She took up her scissors and hacked the grey and scarlet suit into 7 jagged pieces. Then she got to work on the last triangles of the blue and silver suit. It was now very small indeed. "Michael," she said, "hurry up with that spell, it's urgent." Half an hour later, Michael thought he was ready. He came over to Sophie carrying a tiny bowl with a very small amount of green powder in the bottom. "Where do you want it?" "Here," said Sophie, snipping off the last thread. He slid the child-sized suit carefully on the floor. Michael sprinkled powder on it. A moment passed. Michael sighed with relief. The suit was gently spreading out larger. After about 5 minutes, they both agreed that the suit looked Howl's size again. Michael gathered it up and carefully shook the excess powder off into the grate. Calcifer flared and snarled. "Watch it," he said. "That was strong." Sophie took the suit upstairs. Howl was asleep. She put the blue and silver suit on the chest by the window, trying to tell herself that it had got no larger since she picked it up, and took a look out of the window. "Snooping again?" Howl said suddenly. Sophie swung round guiltily to find that Howl was only half awake. "I love Wales, but he doesn't love me. Megan's full of envy because she's respectable, and I'm not." Howl went back to sleep. He did not emerge again that night. There was no sign of him stirring when Sophie and Michael got up next morning. They were careful not to disturb him. Neither of them felt that going to Mrs. Pentstemon's funeral was a good idea. They were hunting for things a dog could eat when they heard him coming slowly downstairs. "Sophie," Howl's voice said accusingly. He was standing inside the top half of a gigantic blue and silver jacket. Behind Howl, the stairs were full of blue and silver suit, trailing back up to his bedroom. "Oh, dear," said Michael. "Howl, it was my fault. Rubbish," said Howl. "I can detect Sophie's hand a mile off. Sophie, dear, where is my other suit?" Sophie fetched the pieces of the grey and scarlet suit out of the broom cupboard, where she had hidden them. Howl grabbed the bundle off her. "I am now going to get ready for the funeral. Please refrain from doing anything whatsoever while I do. I can tell Sophie is in top form at the moment, and I want this room the usual size when I come back into it." He set off with dignity to the bathroom. The rest of the blue and silver suit followed him, dragging downstairs and rustling across the floor. There may have been nearly a mile of it. "I don't think I got that spell quite right," Michael said when the last huge scalloped edge had disappeared. "And didn't he let you know it?" said Calcifer. Howl came out of the bathroom 2 hours later. He was all in black. His suit was black, his boots were black, and his hair was black. His earring was a long jet pendant. Sophie wondered which suit the black one really was. Howl conjured a black tissue and blew his nose on it. He beckoned the dogman. "Come here, Pooch." As the dog crawled reluctantly into the middle of the room, Howl said, "You won't find my other suit in the bathroom, Mrs. Snoop. You're not getting your hands on any of my clothes again." Sophie stopped tiptoeing towards the bathroom and watched Howl walk round the dogman. "What do you think of this as a disguise?" he said. He fell forwards onto hands and knees. By the time he touched the floor, he was a curly red setter. The dogman was taken completely by surprise. His hackles came up and he growled. The two identical dogs walked round one another, glaring. Howl hastily turned himself back. "Good," he said. "If I can deceive another dog, I can fool everyone. No one at the funeral is going to notice a stray dog lifting its leg against the gravestones." He went to the door and turned the knob blue down. "If you're going as a red setter, why take all the trouble of getting yourself up in black?" said Sophie. Howl lifted his chin. "Respect to Mrs. Pentstemon," he said. "She liked one to think of all the details." Several hours passed. Michael and Sophie had just decided to have lunch when Howl's voice rang out from nowhere. "Brace yourself, Calcifer! She's found me!" Calcifer sprang upright, flaming blindingly up the chimney. Almost at once he blurred into a dozen or so burning blue faces, as if he was being shaken violently about. He whipped from side to side. One moment he had multiple orange eyes, the next rows of starry silver ones. Something swept overhead with a boom which shook everything. A second something followed, with a long, shrill roar. Michael scrambled for the window. "They're quite near!" The storm of magic seemed to have affected half the things in the room. The skull was yattering its jaw so hard it was travelling round in circles. At one end of the room, scented steam boiled out of the bathroom. At the other, Howl's guitar made out-of-tune twangings, and Calcifer whipped about harder than ever. Michael put the skull in the sink, opened the window and craned out. Whatever was happening was maddeningly just out of sight. Sophie and Michael ran to the cupboard, where they seized a velvet cloak each and flung them on. Sophie got the one that turned its wearer into a red-bearded man. Michael became a horse. But there was no time to laugh just then. They sped outside. A huge cloud was boiling and twisting just above the chimney top. White flashes stabbed through the murk of it. Then the clot of magic took on the shape of a misty bundle of fighting snakes, which tore in two with a noise like an enormous catfight. One part sped yowling out to sea, and the second went screaming after. Sophie and Michael rushed down the sloping lanes to the dockside. Two clouds were hanging in the air some way out to sea. A dark patch of storm raged between them, flinging up great white-topped waves. An unfortunate ship was caught in that storm. The wind and the waves hit the harbour wall, and white water lashed over the quayside. Among all this was a great deal of screaming and high, singing voices. A number of wet, slithery-looking ladies were dragging themselves up onto the harbour wall. Every one of them had a fishtail instead of legs. "Confound it," said Sophie. "The mermaids from the curse." That meant only two more impossible things to come true now. Howl was kneeling on the left-hand cloud, still dressed in black. Typically enough, he was staring at the mermaid. "Keep your mind on the witch," the horse beside Sophie yelled. The witch was standing on the right-hand cloud with her arms raised. Howl's cloud erupted into flame. Heat from it swept across the harbour, and the stones of the wall steamed. Howl appeared on the tossing ship below. He waved at the witch cheekily. Cloud and witch at once became a savage red bird, diving at the ship. The ship vanished. But the diving bird was going too fast to stop. It plunged into the sea with a huge splash. A 20-foot green hill of water rode smoothly sideways across the harbour wall, sweeping the screaming mermaids into the sea. An arm came out of the side of the horse and hauled Sophie back towards the quay. A second mountain of water rose upward. Out of its smooth side burst a monster, a long, black, clawed thing, half cat, half sea lion, and it came racing down the wall towards the quay. Then another burst out of the wave, racing after the first monster. Sophie fell over a rope, and then a doorstep. The arm came out of the horse and dragged her upright as the two monsters streaked past. Another wave swirled, and two more monsters burst out of that, and the next rolling wave brought two more. "What's going on?" Sophie squawked. "Illusions," Michael's voice said out of the horse. "They're trying to fool one another into chasing the wrong one." "Which is who?" said Sophie. "No idea," said the horse. Sophie and Michael set off through the streets of Port Haven after the monsters. First they followed a river of seawater, then huge wet paw prints, and finally white gouges and scratches where the claws of the creatures had dug into the stones. These led to the marshes, where Sophie and Michael had chased the shooting star. By this time, the creatures were bounding black dots, vanishing into the flat distance. After a while, no one could see anything but empty marks. Then a ball of pale fire rolled lazily up. It must have been enormous. The bang that went with it only reached the watchers when the fireball had become a spreading tower of smoke. Then there was simply peace and silence. Sophie and Michael turned slowly back into Port Haven. Neither of them felt like speaking. Only the dog man seemed happy. When they turned into the street where Howl's house was, a stray cat was crossing the road. The dog man uttered a joyful bark and chased it to the castle doorstep, but it turned and glared. "Hero!" it mewed. "This is all I needed." The dog backed away, looking ashamed. "Howl!" Michael shouted. The cat shrank to kitten size and looked sorry for itself. "You both look ridiculous," it said. "Open the door, I'm exhausted." The cat crawled to the hearth where Calcifer was down to the merest blue flicker. There it grew rather slowly into Howl, bent double. "Did you kill the witch?" Michael asked, taking off his cloak. "No," said Howl. He turned and flopped into the chair, looking very tired indeed. "All that on top of a cold," he croaked. "Sophie, take off that horrible red beard and find the brandy, unless you've turned it into turpentine, of course." Howl drank one glass as if it were water. Then he dripped a second glass carefully on Calcifer. Calcifer revived a little. Howl poured a third glass and lay back, sipping it. "Don't stare at me. I don't know who won. The witch relies mostly on her fire demon and stays behind out of trouble. But I think we gave her something to think about, eh, Calcifer?" "It's old," Calcifer said. "I'm stronger, but it knows things I never thought of. She's had it 100 years, and it's half killed me. You might have warned me." "I did, you old fraud," Howl said wearily. "You know everything I know." He hauled himself to his feet. "Look sharp, Michael. We're not only going to have to move the castle and the Kingsbury entrance now. I shall have to transfer Calcifer to the house that goes with that shop." "Move me?" Calcifer crackled. He was azure with apprehension. "That's right," said Howl. "You have a choice between market chipping or the witch. Don't be difficult." "Curses!" wailed Calcifer, and dived to the bottom of the grate. Howl and Michael dashed about, calling measurements and chalking strange signs. Sophie and the dogman were pushed aside so that Michael could chalk a 5-pointed star inside a circle on the floor. Then they were pushed aside again so that Howl could crawl about, writing signs in and around both star and circle. Howl and Michael raced out to the yard. "Sophie!" Howl shouted. "Quickly! What are we going to sell in that shop?" "Flowers," Sophie said. "Perfect," said Howl, and hurried over to the door with a pot of paint and a small brush. He dipped the brush in the pot and carefully painted the blue blob yellow. He dipped again. The brush came out purple. He painted the green blob with it. At the third dip, the paint was orange, which went over the red blob. Howl did not touch the black blob. He picked up a small jar of powder. "Michael! Where's the silver shovel?" Michael raced in with a spade. Howl sprinkled red powder from the jar on it. He put a pinch of the grains in each point of the star and tipped the rest into the middle. "Stand clear, everyone," he said. "Are you ready, Calcifer?" Calcifer emerged from his log. As ready as I shall ever be. You know this could kill me, don't you? Look on the bright side, said Howl. It could be me it kills. Hold on tight. 1, 2, 3. He dug the shovel into the grate, steadily and slowly, keeping it straight and level. Then he raised it. He stood up and turned round, carrying Calcifer on the shovel. The room filled with smoke. Howl coughed. He had a little trouble holding the shovel steady. Calcifer was a long, pointed blue face, rooted in a faintly glowing black lump with a dent in the front of it. The lump rocked slightly, and Calcifer obviously felt terribly unsafe. He kept shooting feeble little arm-shaped flames out on either side in a useless attempt to take hold of the sides of the shovel. Won't be long, Howl choked. He took a long, careful step into the chalked circle, and then another into the center of the 5-pointed star. There, holding the shovel level, he turned slowly round, one complete turn, and Calcifer turned with him, staring with panic. It felt as if the whole room turned with them. Everything was still swaying as Howl took the same long, careful steps out of the star and the circle. He knelt and slid Calcifer back into the grate, leaned on the shovel, and coughed. The room settled. Howl opened the door with a yellow blob downwards. Outside was the street in market chipping that Sophie had known all her life. Howl shut the door, turned the knob orange down, and opened it again. A wide, weedy drive wound away from the door now. "Where is this?" said Howl. "An empty mansion at the end of the valley," Calcifer said. Howl shut the door and turned the knob round to purple down. "Now for the moving castle." It was nearly dusk out there. Sophie saw a bank of dark leaves drift by, loaded with big purple flowers. The smell was heavenly. "Your long nose stays indoors until tomorrow," Howl said, shutting the door. "That part's on the edge of the waste." "Well done, Calcifer." He flung the shovel down and went to bed. Sophie looked at Calcifer, sleepily flickering among rosy logs. She thought of him pulsing, almost white, and then staring anxiously as he wobbled on the shovel. "Calcifer, were you ever a falling star?" Calcifer opened one orange eye. "Of course." "And Howl caught you?" said Sophie. 5 years ago," said Calcifer. "Out on Port Haven marshes. He chased me in 7-league boots. When Howl offered to keep me alive, the way humans stay alive, I suggested a contract on the spot. Neither of us knew what we were getting into." Next morning, the door was set to black down and would not open at any setting. Sophie took out her impatience by scrubbing the chalked signs off the floor. Hal came in while she was doing it. His suit was still black, but he had turned his hair fair again. Hal picked the skull out of the sink and held it in one hand, mournfully. "Alas, poor Yorick," he said. "She heard mermaids, so it follows there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. I have caught an everlasting cold, but luckily I am terribly dishonest. I cling to that." He coughed pathetically. "What's the matter?" Sophie said. "Miss Angorian not going well?" "Lily Angorian has a heart like a boiled stone," said Howl. After breakfast, Michael and Howl knocked a hole in the wall of the broom cupboard, making an archway that connected the shop and the house. Sophie hobbled after Howl as he went to the castle door and turned the knob to purple down. The door opened. The air was hot and steamy and filled with the scent of flowers. "Who made these flowers right on the edge of the waste?" Sophie said, delighted. "Wizard Suleiman started it a year ago," Howl said. "I think his notion was to make the waste flower and abolish the witch that way. I came and had another go later. That's how I met the witch. She objected." "Won't the witch know you're here?" "I try to do the things she'd least expect," Howl said. "Are you trying to find Prince Justin?" Sophie asked. But Howl slithered out of answering by racing into the castle. They opened the flower shop the next day. It could not have been simpler. Every morning, Sophie took her stick and her scissors and stumped about, chatting to her stick, using it to test the squashy ground or hook down sprays of roses. Then they took the flowers back to the shop and arranged them in a collection of jugs and buckets. 2 of the buckets were actually the 7-league boots. Howl was nearly always missing while they gathered flowers, and the doorknob was always turned black down. After a few days, the shop became very popular. Word had gone round that Jenkins had flowers like no flowers seen before. People Sophie had known all her life came and bought them. None of them recognized her, which made her feel very odd. By the time Howl arrived in the shop, he usually found it quite busy. He made it busier still. This was when Sophie began to be sure that the black suit was really the charmed grey and scarlet one. Sophie found she could keep leftover flowers fresh if she talked to them. She got Michael to make her a plant nutrition spell and experimented. She got soot out of the yard and planted things in it, muttering busily. She grew a navy blue rose like that. Sophie was so delighted with it that she experimented with roots from all the bags hanging on the beams. She told herself she had never been happy. This was not true. Something was wrong, and Sophie could not understand what. Sometimes she thought it was the way no one in market shipping recognized her. Sometimes the trouble seemed to be Calcifer. Calcifer was bored. "When are you going to break my contract with Howl?" he asked more and more often. "I'm working on it," she said. This was not quite true. Sophie found she had some rather terrible ideas about that contract. She was sure that breaking it would be the end of them both. Howl might deserve it, but Calcifer did not. Meanwhile, Sophie's experiments became quite interesting. One had become a small palm tree sprouting onion-scented nuts. Another grew into a pink sunflower. One was slow to grow. At last it put out 2 round green leaves. The next day, it had a long stalk with a large bud on it. The day after that, the bud had opened into a pink flower with 4 petals sprouting from a plump pink middle. "What is that, Mrs. Mad Scientist?" said Howl. "It looks like a squashed baby flower," Michael said. Howl shot Michael an alarmed look, picked up the plant and slid it out of the pot. "I might have guessed. It's mandrake root. Sophie strikes again." So that was almost all the curse come true. That only left the wind to advance an honest mind. If that meant Howl's mind had to be honest, there was a chance the curse might never come true. Sophie told herself it served Howl right, but she still felt alarmed and guilty. The dog man came inside the shop. He sat up and stretched his paws out stiffly in front of him. Sophie realized he was trying to turn into a man. "Try harder," she said. "You can be a man if you want." The dog stretched and strained and managed to heave himself into a distraught, ginger-haired man. "I was... Dog in hedge. You helped," he panted. "Told Letty. I knew you. Was... here before. With witch and shop." He wailed and fell forwards, growing a great deal of grey and white hair as he did so. Sophie stared at the large, shaggy dog that now stood there. "You were with the witch," she said. She remembered now the ginger-haired man who had stared in horror. "Then you know I'm under a spell. Does Letty know too?" The shaggy head nodded. Sophie went to talk to Calcifer. As they were talking, the castle door opened. The doorknob was still set to black down, and they expected Howl to come through it. They were astonished to see Miss Angorian slide cautiously inside. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought Mr. Jenkins might be here." "He's out," Sophie said stiffly. Miss Angorian came pleadingly towards Sophie. "Please don't tell Mr. Jenkins I was here. He only wanted news of my fiancé, Ben Sullivan." "There's no Mr. Sullivan here," Sophie said, and she thought, "That's Wizard Suleiman's name." "I don't believe a word of it." "Oh, I know that," Miss Angorian said. She tried to walk further into the room. Sophie stood in the way. "What a quaint little town," said Miss Angorian, looking out of the window. It's cold market chipping, Sophie said, herding Miss Angorian back towards the door. And what's up those stairs? Howl's private room, Sophie said. And what's through that other door? A flower shop, said Sophie. Nosy Parker, she thought. Miss Angorian stared at Calcifer in a vague way. Calcifer stared back without saying a word. This made Sophie feel better. Only people who understood Calcifer were welcome in Howl's house. Miss Angorian snatched up Howl's guitar with a gasp. Where did you get this? She demanded. Ben had a guitar like this. Howl bought it last winter, Sophie said. Ben would never have parted from his guitar, Miss Angorian said throbbingly. May I take it? It reminds me of Ben. This annoyed Sophie. No, she said. You've no proof it was his. She jerked the guitar out of Miss Angorian's arms. You've no right to walk into people's castles and take the guitars. I've told you, Mr. Sullivan's not here. Now go back to Wales. Go on. And she pushed Miss Angorian through the open door. Miss Angorian backed into the nothingness. You're hard, she said reproachfully. Yes, I am, said Sophie, and slammed the door. Calcifer chuckled. I've never seen anyone got rid of it so fast, he said. This made Sophie feel unkind and guilty. Yah, she said. She seized ferns and lilies from the sink and carried them to the shop, where she rammed them into a bucket. Be daffodils, she told them angrily. Be daffodils in June, you beastly things! Howl sauntered into the shop towards the end of the afternoon. Sophie gave him her fiercest glare. I think that turned me to stone, Howl said. What's the matter? Sophie snarled. What suit are you wearing? Howl looked down at his black garment. Does it matter? Yes, growled Sophie. Howl held up one trailing sleeve. The black colour of it ran downward, revealing a blue and silver sleeve. That one, he said. Sophie gave a wordless grump of rage. The dogman pushed open the door and shambled in. Howl stared. You've got an old English sheepdog. 2 dogs are going to take a lot of feeding. There's only one dog, Sophie said crossly. He's under a spell. He is? Howl caught the dogman by 2 handfuls of shaggy hair. So he is. What do you mean by not telling me about this? You could have noticed for yourself, he said, glaring back. Howl hauled the dog across the tiles. And so I would have done, if I hadn't had things on my mind, he said. Come on. I want you in front of Calcifer. Michael! He yelled. Michael came running. Did you know this dog was really a man? He's not, is he? Michael asked, shocked and surprised. Then I let you off and just blame Sophie, Howl said, hauling the dog through the broom cupboard. But you knew, didn't you, Calcifer? He said as he dragged the dog to the hearth. You never asked, said Calcifer. Do I have to ask you? Howl said. Compared with the way the witch treats her demon, you live a revoltingly easy life. All I ask in return is that you tell me things I need to know. Now help me get this creature to its own shape. All right, Calcifer said, sulkily. This feels like one of the Witch of the Wastes again, doesn't it? Howl said. Yes, there are several layers, said Calcifer. Well, let's get the dog part off anyway. Calcifer surged to a deep, roaring blue. Sophie saw the shaggy dog shape fade away inside the man shape and become a ginger-haired man in a crumpled brown suit. Now, who are you, my friend? Howl asked. The man shakily felt his face. I'm not sure, Calcifer said. The most recent name he answered to was Percival. Howl sat the ex-dog in the chair. Tell us what you do remember. By the feel of you, the witch had you for some time. Yes, said Percival. She took my head off. But you'd be dead, Michael protested. Not necessarily, said Howl, frowning. But I'm not sure the witch put this one back together properly. Calcifer said, this man is incomplete, and he has parts from some other man, too. Don't alarm him, Calcifer, Howl said. Do you know why the witch took your head off, my friend? No, said Percival. I don't remember anything. Sophie knew that could not be true. He snorted rather. Michael asked, Did you ever answer to the name of Justin? Sophie snorted again, even before Percival said, No. The witch called me Gaston, but that isn't my name. Don't crowd in, Michael, said Howl, and don't make Sophie snort again. It'll bring down the castle. Sophie stumped into the shop to look at her daffodil. Something had gone horribly wrong. They were wet brown things, trailing out of a bucket full of poisonous-smelling liquid. Oh, confound it, Sophie yelled. What's all this now? Said Howl, arriving in the shop. He sniffed the bucket. You seem to have some rather efficient weed killer here. How about trying it on those weeds on the drive of the mansion? I feel like killing something, said Sophie. She grabbed a watering can and stumped through into the castle, where she hurled open the door, orange down. You go with her, Percival, Howl said. The mood she's in, she'll kill the trees. So Percival took the bucket. Sophie stumped out into a golden summer evening. The mansion was much grander than Sophie had realized, but it was derelict. Many of the windows were broken, and the shutters were blistered. Huh, said Sophie. The least Howl could do was to make the place look lived in, but no. He's far too busy gadding off to Wales. Sophie took her anger out on the weeds, which died as soon as the stuff in the bucket touched them. You remember a great deal more than you let on, she accused Percival. Why did the witch bring you into the shop with her? She wanted to find out about Howl, Percival said. But you didn't know him, did you? No. But I must have known something. It had to do with a curse, Percival explained. I was trying to stop her, because a curse is an evil thing, and I did it by thinking about Letty. I don't know how I knew her, because Letty said she'd never seen me before, but I knew enough so that when the witch made me tell her about Letty, I said she kept a hat shop in Market Chipping. I was horrified, because I didn't know Letty had a sister. And she turned you into a dog after that, just outside the town, said Percival. Later, you found me stuck in the hedge. Sophie weed-killed her way down another curve of the drive. Then you went to Mrs. Fairfax's? Yes. I was looking for Letty. They were very kind, Percival said. And Wizard Howl kept visiting. Letty asked me to bite him, until Howl began asking her about you, and Sophie narrowly missed weed-killing her shoes. What? He said, I know someone called Sophie who looks a little like you. And Letty said, that's my sister, without thinking. Howl said you were an old woman. And Letty cried and cried. She said, the worst of it is, she'll think she's safe from Howl. And she was so upset that I managed to turn into a man long enough to say I'd keep an eye on you. Sophie spread weed killer in a great smoking arc. I do not need a watchdog. Yes, you do, said Percival. Oh, you did. I arrived far too late. Sophie swung round, weed killer and all. Percival ran. Curse everyone, Sophie cried. She dumped the smoking watering can in the middle of the drive and marched off towards the gateway. Too late, what nonsense. Howl's not only heartless, he's impossible. Who cared that poor Mrs. Pentstemon had relied on Sophie to stop Howl from going to the bad? Sophie was a failure anyway. It came of being the eldest. Mrs. Pentstemon had thought Sophie was Howl's old mother anyway, or had she? Uneasily, Sophie realized that a lady who could detect a charm sewn into a suit could surely detect the witch's magic. Oh, confound that grey and scarlet suit, Sophie said. I refuse to believe that I was the one that got caught with it. A sudden uneasiness swept over her. Her ears had caught a distant tock, tock, tock. There, on the road, behind the gate, was a figure with outstretched arms, popping, popping. Sophie whirled round and sped back to Percival, dragging him behind the nearest tree. She shut her eyes. We're not here. Go away, fast, fast. She opened one eye. The scarecrow, almost between the gateposts, was standing still, swaying uncertainly. That's right, said Sophie. We're not here. Go away fast. 10 times as fast. Go away. and the scarecrow began to hop back up the road. Soon it was going in giant leaps, faster and faster, just as Sophie had told it. Sophie shuddered. She picked up the watering can and stumped back to the mansion. A fluttering caught her eye as she went, from long white curtains at an open French window. She could see curtains at most of the windows, and glass, too. The shutters were newly painted white. Said Sophie. She threw the front door open with a crash. Howl and Michael were at the bench, hastily dismantling a spell. "Eavesdropper!" Sophie shouted. "Snooper! How long have you known I am under a spell?" said Howl. "Well, now, I told him," Michael said. "My Letty." "You?" Sophie shrieked. "There was a time when everyone seemed to be telling me," Howl said. "Even Calcifer when I asked him. But do you honestly think I couldn't spot a strong spell like that? I'd several goes at taking it off, but nothing worked. I came to the conclusion that you like being in disguise." "Disguise?" Sophie yelled. Howl laughed. "Oh, it must be, since you're doing it yourself. What a strange family you are. Is your name Letty, too?" Sophie stumped to the chair. "I'm not going to speak to any of them," she thought. Howl turned to Percival. "I'm glad to see that you have some brain after all. Did you tell Sophie all of it? Or do you really know what the witch was trying to find out?" "She wanted to know about whales," said Percival. "I thought that was it," Howl said soberly, and went into the bathroom. He emerged 2 hours later in a cloud of steam, smelling of gentian. "I may be back late," he said to Michael. "It's going to be Midsummer Day after midnight, and the witch may well try something. Keep all the defences up." Howl turned to Percival. "I think I know what's happened to you. It's going to be a job sorting you out, but I'll have a go tomorrow." Howl went to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. "Sophie, you still not talking to me?" "No," he snarled. Howl sighed and went out. Sophie saw that the knob was pointing black down. "That does it," she thought. "I don't care if it is Midsummer Day tomorrow. I'm leaving." Midsummer Day dawned. About the same moment that it did, Howl crashed in with such a noise that Sophie shot up in her cubbyhole, convinced that the witch was hot on his heels. "They think so much about me that they always play without me," Howl bellowed and fell over the chair. Finally, he discovered the stairs and fell up them on his face. "What's the matter?" Sophie asked. "Rugby club reunion," Howl replied. "Didn't know I used to fly up the wing for my university, did you, Mrs. Nose?" "If you were trying to fly, you must have forgotten how," Sophie said. "I was born to strange sights," said Howl. "Things invisible to see. I know what all past years are, and who cleft the devil's foot." "Go to bed, you fool," Calcifer said sleepily. "You're drunk." "Who, me?" said Howl. "I assure you, my friends, I am Corn-Sword Stober." He got up and stalked upstairs. "What a lie that was," Howl remarked as he walked into the wall. "My shining dishonesty will be the salvation of me." The noise woke Michael and Percival. Michael came downstairs, saying they might as well go out and gather the flowers for the midsummer garlands. Sophie was glad to go out into the place of flowers for one last time. It was getting on for midday before Sophie finally stole away. She reached for her stick, and somebody knocked at the door. "It's the mansion door," said Calcifer. "Flesh and blood, and harmless." This always happens when I try to leave, Sophie thought. She turned the knob orange down and opened the door. There was a carriage in the drive. "Mrs. Cheverell Smith to call upon the new occupants," said a footman. "We're not at..." Sophie began. But Mrs. Cheverell Smith swept the footman aside and came in. It was Fanny. Fanny, looking wonderfully prosperous in cream silk. She was wearing a cream silk hat trimmed with roses, which Sophie remembered only too well. She had said to that hat, "You are going to have to marry money," and it was quite clear that Fanny had. "Oh dear," said Fanny, looking round. "There must be some mistake. This is the servants' quarters. Well, we're not really quite moved in yet, madam, Sophie said. Fanny turned round and gaped. Sophie, she exclaimed. Good gracious, you look about 90. And Fanny flung her arms around Sophie. I didn't know what had happened to you, she sobbed. Martha and Letty didn't know. They changed places, silly girls, did you know? And here you are, working as a servant. Sophie found she was crying, and laughing as well. It's a long story, Sophie said, and you mustn't worry, because Wizard Howl took me in. Wizard Howl? Exclaimed Fanny. That wicked man! Has he done this to you? Let me at him. Sophie did not care to think how Howl might react if Fanny woke him by stabbing him with her parasol. No, she said. Howl has been very kind to me. And this was true, Sophie realized. Considering all Sophie had done to annoy him, Howl had been very good to her indeed. But they say he eats women alive, Fanny said. No, he doesn't really, Sophie said. He's not wicked at all. There was a bit of a fizz from the grate at this. In all the time I've been here, I've not seen him work a single evil spell. There was a clatter of feet in the broom cupboard, and Michael came through, saying, Look who's here! He was holding Martha's hand. Martha almost looked like herself again. She rushed at Sophie, shouting, Sophie, you should have told me! But this was not all. Letty and Mrs. Fairfax came through the cupboard after Martha, carrying a hamper, and after them came Percival. Bless me, it's Fanny, Mrs. Fairfax said. There was such general hugging and exclaiming that Sophie thought it was a marvel Howl did not wake up. I shall have to leave this evening, she thought. While Michael unpacked the hamper, Letty made Percival tell her all that he remembered. He'd just arrived and kept turning into a man and then into different dogs and insisting that he knew me, Letty said to Sophie. I knew I'd never seen him before, but it didn't matter. But you had met Prince Justin, Sophie said. Oh yes, Letty said. He was in disguise in a green uniform, but it was obviously him. He was so smooth and courtly, even when he was annoyed about the finding spells. I had to make him up 2 lots because they would keep showing that Wizard Suleiman was somewhere between us and Market Chipping, and he swore that couldn't be true. By this time, everyone was eating chicken and sipping wine. Calcifer had gone down to green flickers. Sophie looked up and saw Miss Angorian standing by the door, looking shy. I've come at about time, haven't I? Miss Angorian said. I just wanted to talk to Howl. Michael greeted Miss Angorian with a beaming smile. Howl's asleep at the moment, he said. Come and have a glass of wine while you wait. How kind, said Miss Angorian. But the room was full of people who all knew one another very well, and she was the outsider. Miss Angorian seemed rather quickly to decide that she had had enough. Sophie saw her at the door and hurried over, feeling guilty. Please don't go yet, Sophie said. I'll go and wake Howl up. Oh no, I'm quite happy to wait, Miss Angorian said, smiling nervously. I thought I'd go and explore outside. It's stuffy in here with that funny green fire. Sophie politely opened the door. Somehow the knob had got turned purple down. Outside was a misty blaze of sun and the drifting banks of red and purple flowers. What gorgeous rhododendrons! Miss Angorian exclaimed in her most throbbing voice. She sprang eagerly down into the marshy grass. Good gracious, Fanny said, coming up behind Sophie. Wherever is my carriage? Sophie was trying to explain, without really knowing herself, how one door could open on several different places when Calcifer surged up from his logs. Howl! He roared. Howl! Howl Jenkins! The witch has found your sister's family! There were 2 violent thumps overhead, and Howl came tearing downstairs. Got me on my weak flank, blaster! He shouted as he shot across the room and hurled open the door. Sophie hobbled upstairs to Howl's bedroom window. It was drizzling in the neat garden. The witch stood leaning against the swing, tall and commanding. Howl's niece, Mari, was shuffling over the wet grass towards her. Behind her was Neil, glowering, and Howl's sister. Megan was clearly giving the witch a piece of her mind, but she was being drawn towards the witch too. Howl burst onto the lawn and charged at the witch. The witch ran like a cat with a dog after it, with Howl a foot or so behind. The witch vanished over the fence in a red blur. Howl went after in a black blur with trailing sleeves. Then the fence hid them from sight. Sophie went back downstairs to find Letty and Percival opening the door, purple down. The scarecrow loomed up in the doorway, against the flowers. "Shut it!" Sophie screamed, but Miss Angorian was out there. "No, don't," she said weakly. No one was attending anyway. Letty was clutching Martha. Percival was staring, and Michael was trying to catch the skull, which was yattering its teeth so hard that it was threatening to fall off the bench. And the guitar was giving out long, humming twangs. Num, hum, num, hum. Calcifer flamed up the chimney again. "The thing is speaking," he said to Sophie. "It is saying it means no harm. It is waiting for your permission to come in." Sophie looked at the turnip face and the fluttering rags. "Please come in," she said a little croakily. Said the guitar. The scarecrow surged into the room with one sideways hop. It stood swinging about on its one leg, as if it was looking for something. The skull yattered again. The scarecrow spun round and fell sideways towards it. As it fell across the bench, there came the fizzing jolt of magic, and the skull melted into the scarecrow's turnip head. The scarecrow hopped upright, uncertainly, and spun around. "Now I can speak," it said, in a somewhat mushy voice. "I may faint," Fanny announced. "Nonsense," Mrs. Fairfax said. "It's a magician's golem. They're quite harmless." The one who did faint was Percival. He flopped to the floor quite quietly and lay curled up as if he were asleep. The scarecrow stood itself in front of Percival. "This is one of the parts I was sent to find. I must thank you," it said to Sophie. "My skull was far away, and I ran out of strength before I reached it. I would have lain in that hedge forever if you had not talked life into me." "Who sent you? What are you supposed to do?" Sophie said. The scarecrow swung about uncertainly. "More than this," it said. "There are still parts missing." "What is Percival a part of?" Sophie said. "Let it collect itself," said Calcifer. "No one's asked it to explain itself, but..." He suddenly stopped speaking and shrank until barely a green flame showed. Then a new voice spoke, out of nowhere. "Michael Fisher," it said. "Tell your master Howl that I have Lily Angorian in my fortress. I will only let her go if he comes himself to fetch her." The scarecrow whirled round and hopped for the open door. "Oh no!" Michael cried out. "Stop it! The witch must have sent it!" Most people ran after the scarecrow. Sophie ran into the shop, grabbing her stick as she went. "This is my fault," she muttered. "I could have kept Miss Angorian indoors. Howl's not going to forgive me for this in a hurry." She hauled the 7-league boots out of the window display and towed them out onto the pavement. "Let's see, southeast, that way." Then she stepped into them and began to stride. Zip, 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 zip. Sophie had brief glimpses of the mansion, with Fanny's carriage at the door, of bracken on a hillside, of a small river racing into a valley, of a mountain which slanted so steeply under her boot that she stumbled, which stumble brought her to the edge of a deep gorge where she had to take another stride or fall in. And she landed on crumbly yellow sand. She dug her stick in and took another careful stride. Zip! It was fearsomely hot. Clay yellow sand, stretched in all directions, shimmering in the heat. She took another stride and peered into the quivering glare ahead. There was a peculiar-shaped pile about a quarter of a mile off. It was a fantastical shape of twisted little towers, rising to one main tower that pointed slightly askew like a knotty old finger. Sophie climbed out of the boots and trudged off to investigate. As she got nearer, she could see that the building looked like a collection of grainy yellow chimney pots. It had to be a fire demon's work. 2 small orange figures stood waiting for her. Sophie followed them into the fortress, and the entrance vanished as soon as she was through. It was a little like going through the castle door, black knob down. There was a moment of nothingness, followed by murky light. The witch was waiting in a sort of central den. When Sophie walked up, brandishing her stick, the witch backed away. "I am not to be threatened," she said, sounding tired and frail. "Give me Miss Angorian, and you won't be," said Sophie. The page boys melted into sticky orange blobs, which flew towards Sophie. They dodged her stick, and she found herself glued to a pillar by them. Orange, sticky stuff stranded between her ankles when she tried to move, and plucked at her hair quite painfully. "I'd almost rather have green slime," Sophie said. "Let me go." "No," said the witch. "We will wait until Howl comes." "He's not coming," said Sophie. "He's got more sense, and your curse hasn't all worked anyway." "It will," said the witch, smiling slightly. "Now that you have come here, Howl will have to be honest for once." She made another gesture, and a sort of throne trundled out from between 2 pillars. There was a man sitting in it, wearing a green uniform and long, shiny boots, and he had no head on his shoulders at all. Sophie realized she was looking at all that was left of Prince Justice. "Put his head back on at once," Sophie said. "He looks terrible." "I disposed of both heads months ago," said the witch. "I sold Wizard Solomon's skull when I sold his guitar. Prince Justin's head is walking around somewhere with the other leftover parts. This body is a perfect mixture of Justin and Solomon. It is waiting for Howl's head to make it our perfect human. Then we shall have the new King of Ingray, and I shall rule as queen." "You've no right to make jigsaws of people," Sophie said. "And I shouldn't think Howl's head will do a thing you want. It'll slither out." "Howl will do exactly as we say," the witch said with a sly smile. "We shall control his fire demon." "Where is Miss Angorian?" Sophie said, waving her stick. "I'm very tired," said the witch. "People keep spoiling my plans. Howl has caused me most trouble. I've had to use a curse to bring him in, and then you get into what was left of Solomon's brain and cause me more trouble. And now you wave your stick and argue. I am not to be argued with." She turned and wandered off into the murk. Sophie stared. "I think her age has caught up with her," she thought. "She's crazy. I must get loose and rescue Miss Angorian somehow." Remembering that the orange stuff had avoided her stick, Sophie reached back over her shoulders and wagged it back and forth where the sticky stuff met the pillar. "Get out of it," she said. "Let me go." She had worked her head and shoulders loose when there came a dull, booming sound. Then with a crash like 1,000 tea sets falling downstairs, a piece of the fortress wall blew out, and a figure came leaping in through the jagged hole. Sophie turned eagerly, hoping it was Howl. But the black outline had only one leg. It was the Scarecrow. The witch gave a yowl of rage. There was another violent bang, and the 2 of them were wrapped in a magic cloud which battered this way and that, filling the dusty air with shrieks and booms. Sophie's hair frizzed. She was loose, all except her legs, when Sophie saw another person leap through the gap behind the cloud. This one was Howl. He raised his arms and shouted one strange long word, and a roll of thunder came with it. The witch jolted. Claps of sound rang round the pillars, and each echo carried some of the cloud of magic away. When it had become the thinnest white haze, the witch seemed to fold in on herself. As the million soft echoes died, there was nothing left but a pile of bones. Good, thought Sophie. She slashed her legs free and went across to the headless figure on the throne. She took off her shawl and arranged it decently across Prince Justin's shoulders. The Scarecrow began hopping among the bones. "No, my friend," Howl said. "You won't find her heart. Her fire demon will have got that. I think it's had the upper hand of her for a long time. Sad, really." Howl walked towards the throne. "Typical. They break my neck to get here, and they find you tidying up." Sophie looked up. Howl had not bothered to shave or tidy his hair. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his black sleeves were torn in several places. "Oh dear," Sophie thought. "He must love her very much." "I came for Miss Angorian," she explained. "And I thought, if I arranged for your family to visit, it would keep you quiet for once. But no!" Here, the Scarecrow hopped in front of Sophie. "I was sent by Wizard Suleiman," it said in its mushy voice. "I was guarding his bushes from the birds in the waste when the witch caught him. He cast all the magic he could spare on me and ordered me to come to his rescue, but the witch had taken him to pieces, and it has been a hard task. If you had not poked me to life again, I would have failed." It was answering the questions Sophie had asked before they both rushed off. "So when Prince Justin ordered finding spells, they must have kept pointing to you," she said. "To me, or to his skull," said the Scarecrow. "And Percival is made of Wizard Suleiman and Prince Justin," Sophie said. The Scarecrow nodded. "Both parts told me that the witch and her fire demon were no longer together, and I could defeat the witch on our own. I thank you for giving me 10 times my former speed." "Bring that body with you to the castle," Howl said. "I'll sort you out there. Sophie and I have to get back before that fire demon finds a way of getting inside my defenses." Sophie hung back. "But, Miss Angorian, don't you understand?" Howl said, dragging at her. "Miss Angorian is the fire demon. If it gets inside the castle, Calcifer's had it, and so have I." Sophie put both hands over her mouth. "It's been in twice already. But it went out." "Oh, Lord!" groaned Howl. "Did it touch anything?" "The guitar," Sophie admitted. "Then it's still in there," said Howl. "Come on." He pulled Sophie over to the smashed wall. "I'm going to have to raise a wind. Just run, and keep running, or I won't be able to move you." Sophie managed to break into a hobbling run. Howl ran beside her, pulling. Wind leapt up, whistling, then roaring, hot and gritty. Then they were skimming forwards in a sort of slow-motion lope. The stone ground sped past underneath. It was very noisy and not at all comfortable. "It's not Calcifer's fault," Sophie yelled. "I told him not to say." "He wouldn't anyway," Howl shouted back. "He'd never give away a fellow fire demon. He was always my weakest flank." "I thought Wales was," Sophie screamed. "No, I had to leave her an opening. See?" Howl bellowed. "I had to use that curse she'd put on me to get near her." "So you were going to rescue the prince," Sophie shouted. "Why did you pretend to run away?" "I'm a coward," Howl yelled. "Only way I can do something this frightening is to tell myself I'm not doing it." "Oh dear," Sophie thought. "He's being honest. And this is a wind. The last bit of the curse has come true." "Keep running," Howl bawled. "When all that seemed to be left of Suleiman was Percival, they were so scared they had to go out and get drunk. And then you go and play into the witch's hands." "I'm the eldest," Sophie shrieked. "I'm a failure." "Rubbish," Howl shouted. "You just never stop to think. And you're too nice. I was relying on you being too jealous to let that demon near the place." Then the castle was in front of them. Howl slowed down enough to crash the door open and shot Sophie and himself inside. Everything seemed to be normal. Howl dived towards the guitar. Before he could touch it, It burst with a long, melodious boom, and Miss Angorian was suddenly there. "Your witch is dead," Howl said. "Isn't that too bad?" Miss Angorian smiled. "Now I can make myself a better human. The curse is fulfilled. I can lay hands on your heart." She reached down into the grate and plucked Calcifer out of it. Calcifer wobbled on top of her clenched fist, looking terrified. "Help!" he said weakly. "Nobody can help you," said Miss Angorian. "You are going to help me control my new human. Let me show you." Her hand that was holding Calcifer squeezed hard. Howl and Calcifer both screamed. Howl's face turned bluish, and he crashed to the floor. Miss Angorian was astonished. "He's fake Ken," she said. "No, he's not," Calcifer screamed, writhing. "His heart's really quite soft. Let go!" Sophie raised her stick, slowly and gently. This time, she thought for an instant before she acted. "Stick, beat Miss Angorian, but don't hurt anyone else." Then she swung the stick at Miss Angorian's knuckles. Miss Angorian let out a squeal and dropped Calcifer. Poor Calcifer rolled helplessly on the floor, roaring with terror. Sophie dived to rescue him. The stick hit Miss Angorian again on its own, and again, and again. Miss Angorian hissed and staggered. Sophie's stick was smoking with the heat of her. By contrast, Calcifer did not seem very hot. Sophie could feel that the dark lump of Howl's heart was only beating very faintly between her fingers. It had to be Howl's heart she was holding. He had given it to Calcifer as his part of the contract to keep Calcifer alive. What a silly thing to do. Miss Angorian ran for the door. "Stop her!" Sophie shouted. Miss Angorian raced for the door with inhuman speed. Before she reached it, it was blocked by the Scarecrow, looming up with Prince Justin hung across its shoulders. It spread its stick arms across the door, and Miss Angorian backed away. "Calcifer," Sophie said, "I shall have to break your contract. Will it kill you?" "It would if anyone else broke it," Calcifer said hoarsely. "Then have another 1,000 years," Sophie said, and willed very hard. She carefully nipped Calcifer off the black lump. Calcifer whirled loose and hovered by her shoulder as a blue teardrop. "I feel so light," he said. "I'm free." He plunged up the chimney. Sophie turned to Howl with the almost dead black lump. She had to get this right. Kneeling down, she carefully put the lump on Howl's chest and pushed. "Go in," she told it. "Get in there and work." And she pushed. The heart began to beat more strongly. Sophie tried to ignore the scuffles by the door and to keep up a steady, firm pressure. Her hair kept falling across her face in reddish, fair hanks, but she tried to ignore that too. She pushed. The heart went in. Howl gave a loud groan and rolled over onto his face. "Hell's teeth, I've got a hangover!" He got up with a scramble. "I can't stay! I've got to rescue that fool, Sophie!" The stick was entirely flames by now, and it had dawned on Miss Angorian that the Scarecrow would burn. Howl held out one hand and spoke a sentence of those words that lost themselves in claps of thunder. Everything trembled. The stick vanished, and Howl stepped back with a small, hard, black thing in his hand. Miss Angorian whined and held out her arms imploringly. "I'm afraid not," Howl said. "You've had your time. You were going to take my heart and let Calcifer die, weren't you?" He held the black thing between both palms and pushed. The witch's old heart crumbled into black sand, and Miss Angorian faded away. The moment Miss Angorian was gone, the Scarecrow was no longer there either. Two tall men stood in the doorway, smiling at one another. The one with a craggy face had ginger hair. The one with a green uniform had a lace shawl draped round his shoulders. Howl turned to Sophie. "Grey doesn't really suit you," he said. I thought that when I first saw you. Calcifer's gone, Sophie said. I had to break your contract. Howl looked a little sad. Well, we were both hoping you would. Neither of us wanted to end up like the witch and Miss Angorian. Would you call your hair ginger? Red gold, Sophie said. Not much had changed about Howl that she could see, now he had his heart back. And like some people, it's natural. Howl said, I'd been wondering all along if you would turn out to be that lovely girl I met on May Day. Why were you so scared then? If Sophie had been attending, she would have seen Wizard Suleiman go up to Letty. Letty looked quite nervous, as Suleiman loomed craggily over her. It seemed to be the prince's memory I had of you, and not my own at all, he said. That's quite all right, Letty said. It was a mistake. Howl said, I think we ought to live happily ever after. And Sophie thought he meant it. She knew that living happily ever after with Howl would be a good deal more eventful than any story made it sound, though she was determined to try. It should be hair-raising, added Howl. And you'll exploit me, Sophie said. And then you'll cut up all my suits to teach me, said Howl. If Sophie or Howl had had any attention to spare, they might have noticed that Prince Justin, Wizard Suleiman, and Mrs. Fairfax were all trying to speak to Howl, and that Fanny, Martha, and Letty were plucking at Sophie's sleeve, while Michael was dragging at Howl's jacket. Sophie, said Letty, I need your advice. Sir, said Prince Justin, I must thank you for rescuing me from the witch. Sophie, said Martha, the spell's off you. Did you hear? But Sophie and Howl were holding one another's hands and smiling, quite unable to stop. Don't bother me now, said Howl. I only did it for the money. Liar, said Sophie. I said, Michael shouted, that Calcifer's come back. That did get Howl's attention, and Sophie's too. They looked at the grate where, sure enough, the familiar blue face was flickering among the logs. You didn't need to do that, Howl said. I don't mind, as long as I can come and go, Calcifer said. Besides, it's raining out there in Market Chipping.